Number 10. Medieval aliens? With a lot of the tales from medieval times, it is hard to separate sometimes truth from myth. Many of these stories are actually hard to back up that we have from those days, even when they are true. I mean, they happened so long ago, it's not always easy to find substantial evidence which has survived to the modern age. And then there is the fact that a lot of things that happen in the medieval ages sound kind of ridiculous by today's standards. But this one is really something else. Apparently, there were two children who were found by a village who had green skin and spoke a language that was unrecognized by those that found them. The boy sadly did not survive, but the girl did. And when she grew up, she explained that she and her brother had come from a place that was very green and had gotten lost while tending their father's cattle, coming to Woolpit, the village where they were, via a cave. Her skin with time actually lost its green hue apparently, but it's never been determined where these children actually came from geographically, or if they even really existed, if this story is actually true or it's meant to be a folktale. Either way, it's a very strange story, even if we consider it a folktale. Like, what's that supposed to be about? Why was their skin green? And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Bumblebee, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Number 9. Swimming test. I mean, witch trials in general were just a weird time, and one of the trials that was considered the weirdest by far in terms of tests, that is, not like actual trials themselves, cases, would have had to be the swimming test. Oftentimes those being tested were bound first and then basically dunked or tossed into the water after of course having been stripped down to their skivvies. Of course, being that they were bound and adding in the fact that swimming wasn't, commonly something you would have learned back then unless you were someone who lived or worked on a ship, there were accidental deaths that happened in regards to this test. The other super ridiculous part is we didn't really fully understand just yet how buoyant humans were, because we didn't know that human bodies were actually mainly made up of water. So they actually believed that if you floated, you were a witch, and it was a sign of the water basically rejecting you because you were never truly baptized, having rejected the sacrament of baptism because, you're a witch, so you serve Satan. I have to imagine that unless you were flailing aimlessly and drowning spectacularly, that most of those who were dunked were believed to be witches, and then even if you were drowning spectacularly, you might have not made it. Although, to be clear, they didn't usually tie a rope to people so they could pull them back up if that happened. However, I'm sure that didn't always work. This whole thing was pretty ridiculous though, because human bodies are naturally buoyant and don't really sink. It's not witchcraft, that's just science, baby.
Number 8. The Hoover Dam Coincidence. The Hoover Dam, its first victim, sadly, was a man named J.G. Tierney. Now, it was December 20th, 1922, and the official death toll from industrial accidents during the construction of the dam from 1921 to 1935 was around 213 souls. It's pretty sad, that's a lot of people. The earliest and latest victims of the construction just happened to be father and son. How bizarre is that? What a coincidence, right? And if that's not weird enough, both of them died on the same exact day, December 20th. J.G. Tierney sadly drowned while conducting surveys in the Colorado River, and then 13 years later, Patrick Tierney fell off an intake tower right before construction was complete. Coincidence, a very dark Final Destination themed coincidence. I'm terrified. Number 7. Legendary musical neighbors. It's weird how similar some of your neighbors are, right? Growing up, we had like 3 Davids on our street, and they all loved cutting their lawns at 7 a.m., and they were all police officers. Pretty weird coincidence. We all noted that one. Well, the 60s rock icon Jimi Hendrix and the 18th century composer George Friedrich Handel, they were both neighbors. Yeah, a couple hundred years apart, but they both lived in 23 Brock Street and 25 Brock Street in London, just of course at different times, or else one of them's a ghost. But had George had been born 200 years later, we would have gotten the greatest collab of all time. Would have been like Watch the Throne. That would have been an amazing album. Now, if you're local, of course now you'll know there's a site there. It's a big famous landmark. But in terms of coincidences, that's, there's music in the air on Brock Street. Go grab a trumpet and start reading some stuff. Go practice. You never know. The soul of some composer might just haunt you, and then you'll be amazing. Number 6. World War I soldiers. This is one of the most bizarre coincidences ever in history, in my humble opinion. When the First World War ended, the amount of British lives lost were around 1 million souls. Insane to imagine, right? The first recorded casualty of World War I was a soldier named John Parr. Then after a countless number of lives were lost, the last soldier to die was a man named George Edwin Ellison. Both heroes' resting places are in the St. Symphorian Military Cemetery, and they just happened to be 15 feet apart. Now, this was not planned, nor were any of the entries in this list. It's just a bizarre coincidence that was discovered after the fact. Number 5. Atomic survivor. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States detonated 2 nuclear explosions over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is dark history. This, of course, was devastating. The results in this reaction, the blast and the radiation, they took the lives of nearly 90,000 people. But in 2009, the Japanese government confirmed that there was at least one man who was in each city on both days of these attacks, and he lived to tell the tale. He lived to be old as well. This is amazing. On August 6th, Satomu Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on a business trip. Now, he told the British newspaper, quote, "As I was walking along, I heard the sound of a plane, just one plane. I looked up into the sky and I saw the B-29 and it dropped 2 parachutes. I was looking up into the sky at them and then suddenly it was like a flash of magnesium, a great flash in the sky. And then I was blown over." End quote. It's terrible. To have to witness this in real life, I can't even imagine. But by August 9th, he had returned home to Nagasaki only to experience the trauma again for a second time. Now, despite the double radiation exposure, Yamaguchi lived to be 93 years old. Then he sadly passed away in 2010 from stomach cancer. Number 4. Titanic inspection card. This inspection card once belonged to a woman named Marion Meanwell. Now, what could possibly be worrisome or coincidental about an inspection card? Well, it shows how Marion was not intended to be on the Titanic originally, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of the passengers. Now, the card shows that she was originally meant to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic, but now for some reason, the trip that she originally planned was delayed, and now she instead was assigned to the ill-fated Titanic. You can see that the word Majestic was crossed out on her card, which shows us her change in plans. Now, if only people were somehow able to warn her about what was about to strike, I don't know. It's grim to look back at this stuff and see a change in plans. You're like, what happened? I need to know more. Forget Titanic and that made-up story. Where's this movie? Where's Marion's movie? Number 3. Jack Frost. Okay, we got a couple book coincidences coming up next. This one's for the bookworms out there. Here we go. Back in 1920, after finding a copy of Jack Frost and Other Stories in a bookshop, author Anne Parrish told her husband about how much she had loved that book as a child. That would be like me now finding a Captain Underpants book. I would feel nostalgic. Maybe I would grab a copy. Who knows? But when Anne opened that book, she had found the following inscription inside: her own name. She saw Anne Parrish, 209 North Weber Street, Colorado Springs. I mean, what are the odds, people? Can you imagine how lucky is that? It's also pretty creepy, right? I would feel like we're in a simulation if that happened to me. I feel like if I found my old books, there would be doodles. You know, I was that kid who would like ruin a book. It's like, really, dude? I'm glad we don't do that anymore. I'm glad kids aren't leaving their full address in public books, because that's a terrible idea. Don't do that. Number 2. Sir Anthony Hopkins. Yes, we've seen this man on screen our entire lives. The Silence of the Lamb, watched that as a kid. It's a classic right there. Grab that Oscar easy. In the early 1970s, Sir Anthony Hopkins was signed on for a film adaptation of The Girl from Petrovka. Now, to prepare for the role, like any other good actor, he did his homework, and his first step was, of course, to read the book. But oddly, he was unable to find a copy in any bookstore, despite, you know, being Sir Anthony Hopkins. It's a little weird. Then the story goes, while he was sitting in a London train station, Sir Anthony Hopkins noticed a copy of that very book that somebody had left behind. Now, when he opened it, found that book had also been signed by its author, George Pfeiffer. It's like it was waiting for him. It's like, here you go, I signed it. Go be famous. Go grab some Oscars. Enjoy it. And finally, number 1. Late for choir. It was Wednesday, March 1st, 1950. Westside Baptist Church was scheduled to begin choir practice at 7:20 p.m. sharp. Same time as always. Now at 7:25 p.m., minutes after the furnace was lit in the church, a gas leak caused an enormous blast. This was huge. The blast was so intense it blew the windows out of a nearby building. It even disturbed local radio signals. That's how big it was. But somehow, not a single person was there that night. Yeah, every single member of the choir was late. All of them. In different amazing ways. Isn't that bizarre? Be late tomorrow for work. I don't know, just saying. Even Reverend Klempel, who lit the furnace, he went home afterwards to have dinner, but then ran late coming back. The church pianist fell asleep, then woke up at 7:15, way too late. A student was stuck with her math homework, and then 2 other members couldn't get their cars started. So all in total, 15 different people were late for 15 different reasons. Kicking off our list at number 10, John Lennon, or should I say Jay Lennon. Here we go. This one comes from 1966. Now, Now, if you're a Beatles fan or a fan of the Lord, you're in for a treat. Here we go. You've definitely heard about this scandal, hopefully. During an interview with a UK newspaper, John Lennon started talking about the group and the band and how their popularity was on the rise. Normal band stuff, whatever, from John Lennon. But when Jay Lennon said the Beatles were more popular than J. Christ, well, people got V upset. He didn't mean anything bad out of it, per se. He just noticed that the Christianity charts were on a decline around the world. Meanwhile, the Beatles are selling out left, right, and center. I get what he's trying to say, but yeah, he definitely messed up here. When a US newspaper printed this exchange months later, Christians were upset. More popular than Jesus. Look, I know what he's trying to say, but still, you can't say that ever. Some radio stations actually stopped playing the band's music altogether. Christians gathered in bonfires to burn albums. Jay Lennon, not Jay Christ, but Jay Lennon, had to apologize numerous times at press conferences. He had to clear everything up just to move on, get some peace, get some forgiveness from the Lord. Number 9, Natalie Woods' death. Natalie Woods was one of the most talented in Hollywood. The actress was in her early 20s and already she was getting Oscar nominations. She's known for West Side Story and Rebel Without a Cause, but when she was 43 years old, Natalie was sailing with her husband, Robert Wagner. They were sailing off Catalina Island in California, and she lost her life. Now, her death was considered an accident at the time. With very little details, it was classified as an accidental drowning. But come 2013, it was changed. It was changed to drowning and other undetermined factors. Wood, her husband Wagner, and Christopher Walken, yeah, who knew? They were all aboard the 60-foot yacht at the time, November 28th, 1981. The three actors had dinner in the harbor, then returned to the yacht to continue drinking and eating. Wood went missing around midnight, but the new information is that the couple had argued earlier that night. Now, this changes things, right? This changes the whole story. And according to a new report, that same report that was changed in 2013 after a different statement was released from the ship's captain, bruises and scratches that were considered fresh were seen on Wood's body. Woods was officially reported missing at 1:30 in the morning that night. So, a lot of questions, but I don't know. How do you solve that? How many years later?
Number 8, nuclear threequel. This one is kind of scary, honestly. So, during the Korean War's impression of snakes and ladders, game of borders, and front lines changing like the wind, General MacArthur was getting frustrated with the progress, or lack thereof. He wanted a quick solution. Something that would bring a swift end to the conflict, all while flexing a little muscle in the process. Being a big fan of how the US annihilated 2 cities in Japan in the previous war, he proposed that America once again just start dropping nukes Fallout style. While this was being considered, it was ultimately a no-calzone situation, as I like to call it, for the US and the UN. Soviet Russia had just figured out the recipe for nuclear bombs, and would not hesitate to send one their way in return. The US had lost its nuclear monopoly and ushered in the age of mutually assured destruction. And thank God they didn't, to be honest. I love playing the Fallout games, but that doesn't mean I actually want to be in them. Nah, thanks, man. I'm good. I'm good, dude. Number 7, I need a hero. When we all tell stories, we like to tell stories with heroes and villains, beginnings, middles, ends, rising actions, climax, and conclusion. Bad guy hurts good guy perseveres, and he beats bad guy. Credits roll as the hero walks off into the sunset. Now, I'd like to tell you that the Korean War was a tale of good versus evil. But it's more like bad versus evil. Korea was split between Communist North, supported by China and the Soviet Union. The South was supported by the UN and the US. Each has their own dictator wanting to unify Korea in their own image. Yes, the communists were not very nice, but the right-wing dictator installed by the US was arguably just as bad. So in short, a super awesome time to be in Korea. Number 6, Tootsie Slide. This one goes out to all the fans of MacGyver. You're gonna love this one. So during a very cold segment of the Korean War known as the Chosen Mountain, nicknamed Frozen Chosen by the very cold Marines that were stationed there, temperatures were below negative 25 degrees Celsius and morale was lower. Well, actually their ammo count was. So the Marines radioed in an airdrop for Tootsie Rolls, which was just a code name they'd given to mortar shells. Apparently, the radio operator receiving this message did not understand this, and the actual chocolate candy Tootsie Roll was airdropped to the Marines instead. Yeah. Not wanting to waste this processed American delicacy, Americans went full MacGyver and discovered that once chewed and placed in bullet holes or in things that needed to be filled, the treat made for a decent enough repair. If women don't find you handsome, they should at least find you handy. Number 5, stranger danger. We all know if there's a van that rolls up to your neighborhood and there's a man inside offering free candy, it's gonna be a bad time. Well, North Korea might have had the biggest and baddest band in the neighborhood, as it's estimated that 84,000 people were kidnapped during the war. That is so many people. Why was North Korea putting so many faces on the side of milk cartons, you ask? Well, it was mainly a forced repopulation tactic, which again is so messed up I can't even begin to tell you how wrong that is, but also may have been the beginning of a super secret spy program, where North Korea was interested in having biracial spies, making it easier to infiltrate the enemy. Just one of many nefarious activities North Korea has been up to. There is no spy program in North Korea, and I am not saying, I am absolutely saying this of my own free will. Please do not send help. Number 4, not actually a war. While there were a lot of bang bang shooty shooty killy killy during the Korean War, technically it wasn't really a war, even though it feels like one. Being referred to as a police matter. Yeah, the US sent a lot of troops to fight this not war, which in case you're wondering how that's possible, you can take a look at Congress, as Congress never declared war, setting a new precedent. Although, after the millions of dollars spent, the loss of thousands of soldiers on each side, plus the UN force being comprised of 16 other nations. I'm not exactly sure how it's not a war. That's like me saying, I did not do my English essay because it's not an English essay. It's a 2-page opinionated piece that should be 4 pages, but I didn't read the book and just used Cliff Notes. Sorry, Mrs. M. I mean, come on, can you blame me? Have you ever actually tried to sit down and read Lord of the Flies? Not in a school setting? I called the chief last night, you know what? He said it wasn't it. Number 3, Top Gun. Ask any military history guru or anyone who's got a thing for it, and they will tell you that after World War II, military tech was about to get a little crazy. On September 8th, 1950, something a little spicy happened in regards to both military and aviation history. The world's first all-jet dogfight took place. Americans in F-80s and communists piloting the infamous MiG. Despite a movie that I actually think isn't very good, this wasn't great for the Americans. Yes, they did end up shooting down the enemy, but it was clear that the MiG was outperforming the F-80. Forced American aviation to come up with something just a little bit better. Come on guys, you can do it. Number 2, just in case. So it's been years since the Korean War. They've been split in half. DMZ is there. Everything's kosher, right? Well, not exactly. If you followed the news in recent years, you know that North Korea has been doing some unsavory testing with ballistic missiles. However, what some people may not know, and it's kind of messed up when you think about it, is to this day there is still a large number of US soldiers stationed in South Korea. 30,000 to be exact. A remnant from the Korean War, but something that many would consider to be a necessity given the hostile nature of the North Korean regime. Hopefully things stay in a stalemate and don't escalate. We got enough problems on our hands right now. On a side note, there's also a large concentration of US soldiers in Japan as well. Not directly related to the Korean War, but they are in close proximity just in case anything sneaky happens. Okay. Number 1, big boom, little changes. World War I changed lives. It dissolved century-old empires, completely redrew the map. World War II doesn't happen without World War I, and it was so bad, the whole world swore to never let that happen again. Heck, even wars from centuries ago had more cause and effect. The Korean War is very different in this regard. Like previously mentioned, the communists were bad, but the capitalists were not much better. While the lines may not be as blurred as some wars, the outcome was completely different to what most people were used to. When World War II ended, there was cheering in the streets. When the Korean War ended, there just wasn't much to show for it, besides a tragic loss of life, debt, and a new theory about communism that would literally make the exact same thing happen in Vietnam 15 years later. Seriously, the comparisons are uncanny. It's like the exact same thing.
Kicking off the list at number 10, A Day in the Life. So as soon as the sun came up, your life as a Civil War soldier began. You would train day in, day out, preparing for battle. It was important that each soldier knew their role to work together as a unit. Now, I would say that there's no time for fun and games, but they always made time to blow some steam off. In between drills, soldiers would do chores just like we do every day. They would cook meals, do laundry, clean gear, and make sure that everything is smooth. Passing the time was done by playing dominoes or poker. Reading was of course a popular way of passing the time as well, but it was a lot harder to get your hands on a book back then, especially when you're running around between marches and battles. So more often than not, soldiers would trade newspapers with their opponents. You would hear about the Christmas peace treaty, but this would happen as well. They would just trade Papers. A soldier named Milton Barrett, stationed in the 18th Georgia Volunteers, wrote about this back in 1863. They said, "Our regiment had just come off picket. We stood close together and could talk to each other. Then when the officers were not present, we exchanged papers and bartered tobacco for coffee." They would do it when the officers weren't looking. That's the most intriguing part. They would manage this by using a small boat. Tricky, always a way. The first aerial photograph was back in 1860. James Wallace Black took this photo not by using drones or any bowling alley crazy technology we have today, but rather just a hot air balloon. This lovely landscape is the town of Boston, and you're looking at it from 2,000 feet. This was a long time before selfie sticks. Even longer before that, hot air balloons were being used in warfare. The first account of a hot air balloon being used in war was 1794, when the French Committee of Public Safety created the Corps d'Astrociers, which is a hot air balloon squad. They were used in the Battle of Charleroi and Fleurus, and then 70 years later they were used in the American Civil War. They were pretty large as well. They could fit around 5 guys, where smaller balloons like the Eagle and Excelsior only carried 1 soldier. Those were for stealth flights. That'd be pretty brave. Imagine seeing a hot air balloon coming over the horizon and it has soldiers shooting at you. That's incredible. I didn't hear about any of this growing up. They could reach up to 1,000 feet, so they definitely had a vantage point like no other, and they would communicate with soldiers on the ground using flag signals or, of course, telegraphs. The most successful balloon program in the Union was under the command of Thaddeus Lowe. He and Lincoln were allies, and Lowe actually sent a telegraph to Lincoln once describing the view of Washington from above. Call your friends more and describe your view to them. You might get a few things done.
8. Mummy unwrapping parties. What is your favorite idea of a get-together? Let me know down below. I won't judge, I promise. Unless, of course, you say mummy unwrapping parties like some people in the Victorian era might have. Then I will indeed judge you. Thanks to the Napoleonic Wars making their way to Egypt, interest in the country was on the up and up. And while people have been buying mummies since the Elizabethan era, now these rich weirdos bought even more, bringing them back as souvenirs. Once they got to the homestead, they would almost instantly hold parties with all their rich friends where they would unwrap their mummies like a Christmas present. Congratulations! It's exactly what you thought it would be! A 5,000 or 6,000-year-old decaying corpse that smells horrible. Why are rich people like this? I don't get it.
Number 7. Fire hazard Christmas. Like all families at Christmas, we all have our traditions. I'm a good boy all year, so Santa can bring me lots of gifts. Thanks, Santa. My family tradition is to watch the National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation every year. I love that movie. Adam, on the other hand, well, he's a bad boy, and he eats all the chocolate out of his advent calendar before it's time. Don't tell him I said anything though.
I can't help it, I'm sorry.
He's right there. However, one family Christmas tradition was quite popular back in Victorian times, oftentimes called Snapdragon. The basis of this game was to get a large bowl, fill it with dad's brandy, and drop some large raisins in said bowl. Next, get a candle or a match and light it up. Now that there's a large cauldron of flaming liquid and fireballs in your living room, now your objective is to try and knock the raisins out of the dish without getting burned. Fun for the whole family, why not? Just be mindful, that the whole house is made of wood and there's no fire alarms and there's no modern firefighting equipment and everyone's wearing long gowns, and you get the point.
Number 6. Maybe we were apes? November 24th, 1859 marks the day that none other than Charles Darwin published the famous and even infamous On the Origin of Species, presenting his theory of natural selection and questioning the theory of creation. Truly a great day in my opinion. Look, we can talk evolution versus creation in the comment, but there is no denying the evidence presented in On the Origin of Species had people turning heads and questioning everything they thought they knew. Its full title, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, kinda explains it, but basically, Charles' book gave us the idea that species evolve over generations through the process of natural selection, which he backed up with evidence from the Beagle expedition in the 1830s, which to my disappointment had nothing to do with the dog breed beagles.
Number 5. The potato famine. The potato, so rugged, so versatile. Think of all the ways you can prepare a potato. Boiled, broiled, baked, mashed, pan-fried, deep-fried, french fries, hash browns, latkes, and sometimes you can put them in soup. or stew. Usually pretty cheap and filling, the food of peasants, and I love it. However, during 1845 Ireland, a fungus outbreak was taking hold of potato harvests all over the country, thus creating a large famine that would see over 1 million people perish in a famine. Queen Victoria tried to help but was ineffective, and by help I mean the same effort I put into reaching for the TV remote that's too far away on a lazy Sunday.
Number 4, body snatching. Look, back in the day, making a buck was not so easy. Some people who had absolutely no morals went this route. Basically, you wait around for a recently vacant grave to be not vacant, and before the soil can settle, you remove the inhabitant of said grave and go to your local university and say, "Right, I've got this here fresh non-mangled corpse, give me some money and it's all yours." And Bob's your uncle, you are now the very bottom of the barrel, detritus of human existence. But hey, you made some moolah and can afford to eat your next meal. Honestly, while you may be the worst of the worst people, it's partially the doctors and schools that are to blame for even accepting these fresh, illegally exhumed corpses for study in the first place. It may not sound like a specific event, but some people dressed up for it, so there's that.
Number 3, the Tube, innit? The London Underground, baby, the world's first subway, which let me tell you, it's kind of annoying living in Canada when you have two very popular franchises that share two common names for a rapid underground train, Metro and Subway, right? It's so annoying. You Google Metro and Subway and then the grocery store comes.
I never have that.
Okay. Maybe it's a me thing. It's a me thing. Tunnels underneath the city and trains travel through it. It's simple. Well, the first one was opened in 1863, which is an engineering feat to say the least. And it feels like forever ago. I mean, that's older than Canada, for crying out loud. When you think of the Victorian era, you think horses, carriages, top hats, and orphans asking for more gruel. Mind you, the locomotive was different from a modern one, but this is a very modern idea, especially considering that there's no cars yet. Kind of a weird thing.
Number 2, the telephone. On March 7th, 1876, Scotsman Alexander Graham Bell got a patent for his invention of the telephone. 3 days after acquiring the patent, Mr. Bell made his first phone call to his assistant, Thomas A. Watson, saying, "Watson, come here, I want to see ya." And that was that. And we've gone downhill ever since. No, I'm just kidding. The telephone is a huge groundbreaking invention, allowing people to communicate across vast distances. But the phone addiction some of us have to deal with now, man, it's rough. Alexander Graham Bell was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and the whole reason he became interested in the idea of creating the telephone was because of his mother, who was deaf, and his father, Alexander Melville Bell, who was a teacher of elocution, and was famous for the phonetic transcription system he had developed to help the deaf learn to speak, which is really quite sweet, actually.
Number 1, the war to end all wars. Out of all my research about the Victorian era, the start was somewhat muddy. Maybe because historians don't want to take away from North American or Napoleon history. But the end of the Victorian era was more clear. 1914, the war to end all wars. This was the big one, folks. A mixture of militarism, imperialism, alliances, and a power struggle made for a powder keg that ended up exploding in 1914. Unlike a lot of wars, this one actually changed things. Empires fell while others got stronger. Countries on maps were being redrawn. Others stayed the same. The culture? Well, it changed too. What did it? I'm not sure exactly, but what I do know is that when sitting in a wet, freezing, muddy trench for months on end, well, that's horrible, especially when the only thing you have to look at is a red paste that used to be your comrades. It was not a good time. And it made a lot of folks go a little crazy. Number 10, Queen of the Red Sails. In history, when men drop the ball, there's always an iron-willed woman to pick up the slack. Not because a man is telling her to, but because she wants to. How about inheriting a whole pirate fleet from your late husband? Meet Zhang Yisao. Her husband had managed to build quite the little nautical empire, and with his untimely passing, she became the boss. She commanded a fleet of over 400 ships, and estimated between 20 to 60,000 pirates at her peak. She's noted for organizing and uniting pirates into a confederation. She also had some imperial entanglements, having entered conflict with the East India Company and the Portuguese Empire. This is a lot to go through, especially when I get anxiety from being left alone at the cashier at the grocery store. Number 9, Double Trouble. The Trung sisters from Vietnam are still celebrated today because, honey, they went through a lot. The sisters led the first resistance against Chinese dominance, which at the time had lasted over 247 years. Many believe Vietnam wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for their efforts, gathering 80,000 people to join their cause, once killing a tiger and writing a proclamation of war on its hide. They managed to hold off the Chinese forces for 3 years before finally being overtaken. The Trunk sisters are a great deal of national pride and pride amongst many women in Vietnam. Sadly, the Chinese proved too strong. But to prevent capture, the sisters later drowned in a last fit of defiance.
Number 8 is one I struggle not to laugh about. It's the Prince Philip movement. Prince Philip had many titles and honors being a British royal, but did you know in a remote South Pacific colony he was actually believed to be a deity? This is a wild ride, but the Prince Philip movement, a sect followed by the Yehonanan tribe on southern island of Tanna and Vanuatu, believed him to be the pale son of an ancient mountain spirit. The origins of Philip's divine status and why he's assumed to be the spirit's son is unclear. It's believed this mountain spirit's son, though, would travel to a distant land marrying a powerful lady and in time return, which solidified to the people of Tanna the belief that Philip was the embodiment of the spirit when he and the queen visited Vanuatu in 1974, when he was still unaware of his status as a deity there. The love of Philip was so strong that the British resident commissioner in Vanuatu requested the special photographs on behalf of the people, which Philip actually granted. In return, they sent him a pig slaughter club that he posed with at Buckingham Palace for them. He also met privately with a group of 5 Tanna community members that were flown to Britain for a reality show meet and greet. The photographs of Prince Philip remained with the chief Jack Nevaeh, who died in 2009, having never saw his dream of the Duke's return to Tanna realized. For decades, 2 villages on the Vanuatuan island of Tanna have revered the Duke of Edinburgh as a godlike spiritual figure. At his passing, the peoples mourned deeply, and BBC reported that a private message to the Queen Elizabeth had even been given to journalists at scene, who conveyed it to the British officials before her passing. This one is kind of wacky in a fun way. Number 7 is Realism. Rail has had a colorful life. Race car driver, cabaret singer, and alien communicator. He called the aliens the Elohim, and the pitch of his cult is that the Elohim are historically mistaken for gods by ancient civilizations and are the explanations for many of the great wonders of the world and historic advancements. He says Elohim had hybrid children with humans that were prophets to humanity for news about their origins. Examples of these prophets were said to be Buddha, Gandhi, Muhammad, Jesus, and of course Rael himself. They also believed Earth is in the age of apocalypse and we need to harness new scientific and technological development for peaceful purposes, and that when this has been achieved, the Elohim will return to Earth and share their technology with humanity to establish a utopia. As a result, on their compound in France and then Quebec, Raelians have sought to build an embassy for the Elohim that incorporates a landing pad for their spaceships, as well as gardens and temples. Rael's other interests included rampant banging, so of course he had a harem with the fun title Order of Angels. He was also super into the idea of cloning and created Clonade, an organization that engaged in the research of human cloning, but their 2002 claim of a successful clone is highly scrutinized, as no scientific proof was found, and it was also brought to the public attention. Most of the staff had no education in science. Regardless, the international Realism movement claims tens of thousands of members, the majority in the francophone areas of Western Europe and North America and parts of East Asia. They often attract younger members due to their endorsement of LGBTA and women's rights, as well as aid in climate and nuclear protests. Also, the aliens apparently promised us alien pleasure bots, so I think some people just want to see if that's for real. My feet-phobic people, it's time to tune out. Number 6 is the foot reading cult. Let's unpack this whole disaster. To start, leader Hogen Fukunaga claims to be the reincarnation of both Jesus and Buddha and can diagnose followers' problems by simply examining their feet, and that they would die if they were not examined appropriately. But in reality, he is a money-grubbing millionaire who took advantage of the sick and fearful. New members were initiated by being forced to stay up for days and run around the streets yelling cheesy self-help book lines like "I am living a happy and healthy life," after they'd have the joyous opportunity of being shoved into private rooms where they're intimidated by thugs into giving the cult more money. Hogan charged a whopping $900 per foot reading sessions, and people who are conducting said foot readings are not qualified medical professionals in any way and have no idea what they're talking about. They take advantage of desperate people who come in for sessions looking for answers and end up leaving paying obscene amounts of money on sessions, ornaments, scrolls, books. There are numerous accounts of people who failed to attend all of Fukunaga's sessions and are guilt-tripped, told that they would die or their illnesses were their own fault. In 1987, the group gained official recognition as a religious corporation, and the businessman started raking in over $30,000 monthly from his scams. Naturally, the authorities are on his tail for tax evasion and 3 lawsuits of fraud, which in a 1-year window after turned into 1,000 lawsuits of fraud, totaling in 5.4 billion yen owed. Freedomites are number 5, and they are a subcult of a cult first started in Russia as an opposition to materialistic and governed society. Called the Doukhobors, I'm not sure if I say it right, they came to Canada in 1899 fleeing persecution in Russia. Here they became the Freedomites, who insisted on 3 things: communal living, nudity, and anarchy. The Freedomites are a peaceful people, periodically setting fire to their shacks and then stripping naked and hurling their clothes into the flames. They became most famous for their all-nude public demonstrations to show opposition to the materialistic tendencies of society: taxes, economy, money, etc. And in the 20s and 30s, they even stripped naked publicly to burn and detonate a whole slew of buildings to show their disdain for the government. They had been held accountable for 1,112 depredations and have caused 20 million in damage and taken 20 lives. In 1961, we saw the arrest of 120 Freedomites planning national sieges. The prisoners were of course sent to BC's Agassiz fireproof prison, which prevent the Freedomites from doing their favorite thing: burning it down. A book titled Terror in the Name of God, a study of Doukhobors, written by Vancouver newswoman Sima Holt, highlighted Freedomite contentions and factually debunked some of their misconceptions and put forth revealing context as being only one of many fanatical Russian religious sects. When some of the locked up Freedomites read it, they actually started to change their tunes a little. Younger Freedomites began working in the prisons, asking for other books and school teachers, and slowly shed their traditional emo attitude. To date, 14 have been paroled, and Canadian officials proudly announced that the first returnees to Freedomite lands applied for Government Land Office to buy the land. For the first time, Freedomites will be land-owning, tax-paying citizens. True Weight Cult comes in at number 4. Originally a professor in Taiwan for 9 years, after 37 years an atheist, he woke up one day, first religious revelation. A voice said to pursue religion, so he did. He studied every religious text he could find and then joined a UFO cult. Hated the leader, so he dipped and took about a dozen of the followers with him to start his own cult. He gained them fast and had them open up satellite churches by 1996. What were their beliefs, you may ask? Well, he claimed that 99% of the Buddhist temples in Taiwan were led by vampiric outside spirits, the Jesus reincarnate lived in Vancouver, the universe is 4.5 trillion years old, our solar system was created by nuclear war, we each have 3 souls, and that humanity has been rescued on 5 occasions by God descending in a flying saucer. Their whole goal was, as people increased their spiritual light during the time on Earth, they would be able to escape karmatic reincarnation. This meant achieving enlightenment, the state of being that their leader Chen also called Buddhahood. Chen pulled his followers' tails a ridiculous amount. He had them move from Taiwan to America, which only 150 of his few thousand followers could even do, live in cramped conditions, give him their money. The final escalation is when Chen told them on March 31st, 1998 at 12:01 a.m. God would appear before the world on a single TV channel in the USA. When this prophecy failed, he stared into the sun for a while in front of his followers and reporters and stated that no mere man could have done it for that long. He had them shake their own hands and speak out loud and claimed that that is proof of God being everywhere and in everyone, so technically his prophecy didn't fail and he wasn't wrong. His followers began to dwindle and eventually disbanded due to unfulfilled prophecies and visa issues, as cult member is not a valid reason to renew a tourism visa. Concerned Christians anti-cult is number 3. To explain, an anti-cult pastor preaching about cults became a cult. Okay, known as Monty, Kim Miller founded the Concerned Christians to speak against mind control perpetrated by religious extremists, as well as keep Christianity apocalyptic and severe. Monty was never raised religious. In fact, his first exposure was the Christian club at the university, which seemingly had him convert almost overnight. He directly enjoyed the concept that no one belonged to themselves, rather that humans were purchased at the cost of Christ's blood, and thus everyone belonged to Christianity. That's not the best reason to be a convert. He was hostile to anyone he deemed sacrilegious, but usually Monty condemned easy targets like liberal churches and cults, which gave him credibility as a preacher for discrediting perceived false teachings. But sometimes giving someone an audience is a bad thing, i.e. Donald Trump. His disciples failed to notice his message and personality were shifting because his charismatic delivery remained so compelling. His message was now that they were selected by God to be the only true church and that they must abide by the holy laws and spiritual regulations. He used tactics he'd learned watching cults to isolate and control his flock, cutting ties from local churches and organizations. Forced to live in group homes, they were also forced to pour all their money and resources into Monty. An absurd $100,000 per family per year was expected. As his financial situation worsened, Monty took all assets from families and began the prophecy of his own death in late 1999, and that they needed to go to Jerusalem for his death, despite their aggressive anti-Semitism. The group departs suddenly overnight, leaving gifts for their family behind. The families obviously alert authorities, and cult members were desperately searched for. Some of these devotees were found in Israel, but the rest were never found. Leader Monty was one of those that still hasn't been located, but rumors imply he may just be hiding for tax evasion, fraud, and lawsuits in Greece. The Seekers is number 2. If you live in Oak Park, Chicago, 1954, your Christmas Eve may have been interrupted by a group of carolers not singing but rather screeching at the sky. 200 people amassed to watch the carolers, and police arrived to investigate the commotion. They found the Seekers, led by 54-year-old Dorothy Martin, who egged on her followers in the promise that a spaceship would come rescue them from Earth, while those who stayed behind were doomed to perish in a cataclysmic flood. Dorothy claimed to be able to speak with these aliens, which started one day in 1953 when she was sitting home alone. She says her mind went blank, her arm went numb, and then pins and needly, and she placed a pen in her numb hand and apparently wrote messages from spirits. She learned every time she kept her mind blank, she could channel first her dead dad, then aliens. She meets Michigan State physician Charles at a New Age aliens group, which has a small group of like-minded adults seeking access to extraterrestrial knowledge. They believed Dorothy to be a conduit and followed her quickly, just in time for her to receive a very out-of-pocket message from her alien guides of a coming apocalypse and a chance to evade it in the form of a UFO landing in a nearby airbase. No such UFO arrived though, and Dorothy felt like a failure until her alien buddy told her that the rising of a sunken empire would flood much of Earth, and UFO round 2 was set to land later in 1954. They set out pamphlets and letters trying to warn the world. Before the 24th, there were 2 other false alarms. The Seekers were grasping at straws, as was Dorothy. So when they were told to go out and sing carols to call the aliens on Christmas Eve, they did. But they never came. Nothing ever changed, and the Seekers simply went home one by one, and Dorothy went to a mental institute. And in at number 1 today is The Virtual Reptilian Cult by Schreiner. Born in a severely religious home, there's no doubt it attributed to the religion-based delusions Schreiner experienced as a child and into adulthood, as even she claims she was proclaiming God's name by the age of 2, and she was reborn by the age of 5, and by age 12 she'd read the Bible cover to cover and had a fascination with the Book of Revelations for its strange imagery and apocalyptic predictions. She developed horrific haunting night terrors, and she believed they were because Jesus was not Jesus and instead the son of Satan, and Jesus that they had believed to be executed on the cross was actually Satan's son, so he's wrongly worshipped. She believed her night terrors were this Satan's son, who realized what she knew and sieged her sleeping brain so she couldn't tell the good Christians of the world they thought worshipped a false idol. Whew. She'd given herself a new title as King David's granddaughter as well, and she believed that she had also discovered the alien agenda and that aliens are paranormal and creating the biggest deception of all time, and they aren't extraterrestrial but subterranean and live amongst us in secret underground bunkers. It's the early 2000s, so Sherry hits YouTube to tell the world her theory. Between that and her web domain in 2004, Sherry had an online following of 2,100 people who also believed that demonic alien reptiles were sent by Satan to take over the world. After lots of money grubbing and Sherry becoming rich off of snake oils, this goofy nightmare ends in tragedy when a follower of Sherry takes her own life on Sherry's advisement, and another had his significant other take his. Sherry passes away not long after herself in 2018, anticlimactic from natural causes. You can still visit her active website and YouTube channel today though.
10. Not till the fat lady sings. Most people would be delighted to know that a war is over. War sucks, it's expensive, costs lives, and come on man, it just sucks. Officially, North and South Korea have not signed a peace treaty. That's right. Although they both agreed to an armistice in 1953, on solid paper, there's no surrender, which technically means they're still at war. This sounds bad, but it can't be, right? Not as if tensions between these two could ever be high. It's not as if they're scheming of ways to undermine each other and just waiting for an excuse to open the biggest can of whoop ass at a minute's notice, right? Everything's fine. I don't know if everything's fine. Number 9. Up and down. The Korean War was a great military success and everyone went home happy. Very nice, great success. Just kidding, actually. It didn't really solve anything. What's so messed up is everyone just kinda ended up where they started. North Korea had pushed into the south, almost making it all the way south, when the very effective UN organized a police force of multiple nations, mostly US, and punched their way back up to the 38th parallel. But maybe we better go further, ballsy General MacArthur Douglas said to himself, admiring his own reflection in the mirror, pushing their way all the way up to the Chinese border, where 250,000 Chinese soldiers helped the UN force by pushing them back down to the 38th parallel, putting everyone in the same position they were in the beginning. It's almost as if war was the pointless cost of life. Nah, that can't be right, no.
One of the most emotive and spectacular paintings to come out of the French Salon depicts the death of the 9day queen. So, the third scandal in our countdown is the tragic story of Lady Jane Grey, the 9day queen following the death of Edward II. Jane was the granddaughter of Henry VIII and at only 17 years old is proclaimed queen in a desperate bid to maintain Protestant rule in England. So, while she wasn't actually technically next in line, Edward, son and successor of Henry VIII, wanted to keep the Protestant line going, so his written will removed his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, from the line on account of their illegitimacy, subverting their claims under the Third Succession Act. Yeah, no, Jane's reign literally lasts 10 days at most. People didn't like the Protestants, and it was very easy for Mary I, the rightful heir, to amass support and overthrow Jane, who I may remind you is not a mastermind seeking power. She is a teenage girl being used as a pawn. Now, to run Mary her credit, she recognized this, and she was lenient by just keeping Jane in the Tower of London. But then it's Jane's father, who's not in prison and going out on the streets protesting Mary like an idiot. He participates in another rebellion against her and uses Jane as a potential figurehead. At that point, Mary's like, I don't know what else I can do. I don't want to kill, but you guys are going to keep rebelling. So her hand is forced to sentence Jane to death and end the rebellions. And speaking of Mary, which we'll be doing a lot, let's get nosy about her mystery heir. It is in 1554, at 38 years old, Bloody Mary, aka Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, began showing signs of her first pregnancy. Rumors spread through Europe like wildfire as the people awaited Mary's firstborn child. Precautions were mapped out to the nines, since this was the first queen to be on the throne, and women tended to drop like MFing flies due to pregnancy back in the day. Mary's husband Philip lined up to marry Mary's half-sister Elizabeth in the event that Mary died in childbirth, because when you're pregnant and violently ill, nothing says you got this babe, I believe in you honey, more than listening to your husband's emergency plan to bang your sister. In the end, no pregnancy ever comes of Mary's symptoms. One theory is that Mary had actually fallen ill and mistaken her morning sickness for being a pregnancy sickness. Some people believe that Mary was in fact pregnant at one time and tragically lost the child. Notoriously, her mother struggled immensely with infertility, and this may have been a genetic issue. From 1558, Mary had another pregnancy scare, and it unfolded the same way. Only this time we know the sickness she mistook for pregnancy was likely caused by either rupturing cysts or cancer. Her sickness couldn't have come at a worse time, with an epidemic of influenza running rampant through the country, and at 42 years old, Mary I dies heirless. Let's flip sides and check on Mary's sister, their stepmother, and that one creepy uncle. So this involves the future Queen Elizabeth and her step-uncle Thomas Seymour after the death of Henry VIII. Following the execution of her mother Anne Boleyn when Elizabeth was only 3, Elizabeth meets a flurry of brides and wives before it all ends with Catherine Parr, who's married to Henry when he dies in 1547. With Edward appointed king, Catherine soon married Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Jane Seymour, who was Henry's favorite wife. Stepmother to Elizabeth, Catherine brings the girl to her and Thomas's home, where Elizabeth is subjugated to late night and early morning visits from the horrible man. Something historians believe affected her for the rest of her life, especially since Catherine, knowing what was happening to Elizabeth, did nothing. When she did, it was only to blame Elizabeth for what happened to her and send her away. Ultimately, Elizabeth gets blamed by a lot of people for what happened to her, and in 1548, the same year Elizabeth is sent away and Catherine dies, Thomas decides it's his time to rise to power. In addition to attempts to strengthen his position by winning over naval forces and trying to now convince Elizabeth to be with him, Thomas concocted a master plan to kidnap King Edward. The king! Kidnap! During his attempted kidnapping, Thomas accidentally kills one of Edward's dogs and is quickly captured by the king's guard. In 1549, Thomas was charged by the crown with 33 counts of treason, including conspiring to marry Elizabeth, who was then second in line to the English throne, and killing a royal dog. He met a brutal end at the Tower of London on March 20th of 1549, with the executioner taking 2 blows of an axe to fully sever his head. I hope Elizabeth could smile and feel a little bit of relief when she heard that news. And speaking of Elizabeth and Anne, let's learn about Mary Boleyn's baby bump. By 1534, having failed to bear Henry Victoria's son, Anne Boleyn's influence on him is declining. So, she had a good reason to be humiliated when her widowed sister Mary, also the former spank bank of her own husband, the king, appeared at court noticeably pregnant. Turns out good old Mary had secretly married William Stafford, a non-reputable man who was simply the son of a wealthier upper-class landowner. Since Stafford was a soldier and the second-born son in his family, trust me, that weirdly made a difference. His prospects and income were small, and many believed the union was actually out of genuine love as a result, which is something that toxic-ass royal family could not comprehend. Not like any of them had had healthy examples of relationships or raised around loving parents. So yeah, when caught repping a gut, Mary confessed that she had secretly and out of necessity married for love Mr. Plain William Stafford, a younger son of a knightly birth with no fortune. Anne was furious, for Stafford was no match for the Queen's sister. Anne has no hesitation in persuading the king to banish the disgraced couple from the court. It's brutal for them financially, and Mary consistently reaches out to Henry and Anne to have some compassion. She admitted that she might have chosen a greater man of birth, but never one that should have loved her so well, nor a more honest man. To quote, "I had rather beg my bread with him than to be the greatest queen in Christendom, and I believe verily he would not forsake me to be a king." It's Anne who relents, sending Mary a magnificent golden cup and a fat stack of cash. This partial reconciliation was the closest the two sisters ever attained, and they never met face to face again. And why didn't they meet face to face again? Only because of the arguably biggest Tudor scandal there is, the fall of Anne Boleyn. This is the year 1536, and the hottest headline has just hit the news cycle. Turns out Queen Anne's royal garden has let some dirty peasants inside to, how can I say this, water her flowers? To be extremely direct, she was accused of adultery with 5 men, and yes, I'm serious, one was her brother. Dude, could you imagine if that allegation happened now? It would be absolutely insane. Now imagine in an era where women had to wear 36 layers of material to not be called a slag and also had 0 rights. It was all too believable. The state papers contained many cases of people damning Anne, as she clearly enjoyed flirting with men in her circle. Most of these men were arrested, and Anne herself was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where she was watched and her every word reported. Her indiscreet talking about her compromising banter with her alleged lovers literally only reinforced the case against her. The 5 men were condemned to death, and she was subjected to a show trial in the Great Hall of the Tower and found guilty of treason. 4 days later, it was death to Anne Boleyn. Meanwhile, happening at pretty much the same time was an illicit liaison. And I mean same time, quite literally. It was the same summer of 1536 when Henry's own niece, Margaret Douglas, was imprisoned in the Tower under sentence of death. Her crime was also to do with having the audacity to act as a woman with autonomy. She entered into a binding pre-contract of marriage with Lord Thomas Howard, which was treason in the eyes of the king, who was convinced that Thomas had been aspiring for the crown. Fortunately, Henry was fond of Margaret, which means their heads didn't have to be relocated, but their love did. He spared the lovers a sentence of death and commuted it to imprisonment in the Tower. Their love poems still survive and are displayed for the world to see their doomed romance, as Thomas tragically died there of fever in 1537, just days after Margaret had been pardoned, and she was still mourning her lost lover for years later. Similar to Margaret, this family member was swooped up and away to the Tower for the crime of love. Dramatic and romantic, we love a fun mix. This is about Catherine Grey's secret pregnancy and how in 1562, her cousin Elizabeth I has Catherine arrested and taken to, you guessed it, Tower of London. Why? She had dared to secretly marry her lover, Edward Seymour. Catherine was the elder of the 2 surviving sisters of Lady Jane Grey. From the moment she came to the throne, Elizabeth made it clear she could not abide the sight of Catherine, probably to do with the fact she was hella sensitive about her own legitimacy issues due to the whole dad killed mom thing. Follow that up with the fact older sis Mary killing Catherine's older sis Jane thing, Elizabeth naturally distrusted any other persons of royal blood to not want to get revenge or her throne, particularly those whose place in the succession had been confirmed by the Act of Parliament, as Catherine's had. In 1560, Catherine married Edward Seymour, the nephew of Jane Seymour, out of love. For a person of royal blood to marry without the monarch's consent was treasonous, and when Elizabeth heard of it, she wasted no time placing Catherine, who was already pregnant, and her new husband in the Tower. Catherine gives birth to a son, and Elizabeth is pissed. She puts orders from now on Catherine and her husband have to be kept strictly apart. Turns out when you aren't a snobby twit, you can make friends with the guards. So February 1563, Catherine gives birth to a second son in the Tower. Hilariously, 2 of their guards, meant to keep them apart, stand as the godfathers at the christening. When Elizabeth found out, her fury knew no bounds. The Spanish ambassador observed that she turned the color of a corpse. She ordered that Catherine and her husband be removed immediately from the tower and sent to different places of imprisonment. No matter how many times Catherine wrote and begged, Elizabeth never changed her mind. Catherine's health suffered a serious decline, exacerbated by her refusal to eat and serious depression. In January 1568, she died, aged just 27. "In the world to come, I hope to live forever," she told one of her attendants, "for here is nothing but care and misery." Alright, our last dirty dish of drama on the list will debate victim or vixen. Called his rose without a thorn, Catherine Howard, the 5th wife of Henry VIII, has received mostly apathy since her death on the 13th of February 1542. Catherine Howard is a woman in control of her sensuality in a time it is not accepted, and it can be routed back to her youth being raised by the Dowager Duchess Agnes Howard. She was comfortably accepting of letting the girls in her care explore their adult bodies as they got older, as long as they didn't go too far with anyone. This type of openness was rare and allowed Catherine to develop a basis of what she bodily enjoyed, but also that she could experience bodily enjoyment. Catherine lost her virginity out of wedlock and turned down the man who had taken it, Dereham, when he offered marriage. She didn't want to marry her first adult partner. She knew ways to prevent herself from falling pregnant, and given that marriage was all she'd been raised for, was understandably hesitant to tie herself down to the first person when she just discovered the joys of intercourse with none of the responsibility. Like two of her predecessors, her ill-fated cousin Anne Boleyn and Henry's beloved 3rd wife Jane Seymour, Catherine caught Henry's attention as a lady-in-waiting to the queen who preceded her, Anne of Cleves. Young and full of life, Catherine enchanted him. Nothing was too good for her, and her family was quick to encourage his affection and brush Catherine's past relationship with Dereham and other men under the carpet. Catherine might have survived the king, or at least survived a little bit longer, if it wasn't for her relationship with Thomas Culpeper. Sure, there's no confirmation they consummated the relationship similar to her and Henry Mannix, but what about sneaking a man into your room who isn't your fat, ugly husband? Looks good, homegirl. Henry's initial reaction to the accusations was one of fury. He demanded an investigation be carried out and dispel what he believed to be vile rumors, and turns out everybody is stupid. Literally everyone folds, no pressure, and it just admits to everything. Mannix, Dereham, Culpeper, even Catherine breaks down crying and admits she let Dereham enter her magic gardens, but no other man. Doesn't matter to Henry though, and everyone's sentenced to death. So we're gonna start with a classic, naturally, a very public affair. In 510, when Catherine of Aragon was expecting their 2nd child, Henry VIII strayed from his marriage for the first time. This was a time era when it was believed intercourse during pregnancy would affect the baby. Seeing as his heir was riding kangaroo style all up in his wife, and Henry had manly needs he evidently just couldn't contain, he found himself in bed with Anne, aka Lady Hastings. He kept his affair with Anne a secret until her own sister, Lady Fitzwalter, wishing to spare their family a scandal, told their brother, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham naturally berated Anne, and her right husband carried her off to a nunnery. The king then showed great displeasure and banished the Lady Fitzwalter from the court. Why? Henry was convinced she had set women to spy on him in order to tell the queen of his adultery. But Henry comes to find out that the Queen Catherine already knew. She didn't need spies, and boy was she pissed. The result was a very public blowout between the couple. Yet it was a wife's duty to maintain a dignified silence in the face of infidelity, and in the end, Catherine conceded defeat and sucked up the fact she married a loser. And while Catherine never provided a male heir, someone did. Let's meet the illegitimate son. Henry had a tendency to marry women that just couldn't provide a son no matter how long he pined for a legitimate male heir. But it did not take long for him to have an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. His mother was an attractive girl about the court named Bessie Blount. Surprisingly, the king acknowledged the crap out of this illegitimate heir. On the 18th of June 1525, in a ceremony in London's Grand Bridewell Palace, then 6 years old, Henry Fitzroy was made the Earl of Nottingham and the Duke of both Richmond and Somerset. The right high noble prince, as the youngster was now styled, had become the highest ranking member of English nobility. Henry loved him like his own soul, the Venetian ambassador reported, and as the king himself put it, Fitzroy was my worldly jewel. Historian contemporaries fully believe Fitzroy was being groomed for the throne before his premature death from consumption. There's a decent amount of evidence to uphold this notion, such as the meeting of the Privy Council of June 1536. The Earl of Sussex VI declared that Fitzroy would make a better choice of a monarch than Mary, as Mary and Elizabeth were both illegitimates as well. As the princess was a bastard as well as the Duke of Richmond, it would be right to prefer the male to the female, the Earl had said, and Henry agreed.
Number 8. Venus and Earth. Venus and Earth are both very close in size and mass. They also are made up of the same composition, not to mention that we're neighboring planets. It's pretty cool. But if you haven't noticed, one planet is full of life, water, oceans, and has McDonald's. The other is a galactic wasteland with an atmosphere 100 times thicker than Earth, and it rains sulfuric acid on a hellish landscape below. Also, no McDonald's. I think that's my indicator for like a planet. No McDonald's? I'm not going. The running theory is that Venus used to be a sister planet to Earth, or just like Earth, and may have supported life with oceans and all the beautiful stuff we have. However, whether it was the inhabitants of Venus or a natural disaster, she is no more. So the theory is there was something there, now there's not. Strange. Yeah, that's strange. Number 7. White holes. Black holes are those magnificent space holes with a gravitational pull so powerful that even light can't escape its grasp once it passes the point of no return called the event horizon. We're not sure if there is a yin to the yang of a black hole, but there's a theory that white holes exist. Get your mind out of the gutter. Okay, so if a black hole sucks everything in at the event horizon, then perhaps a white hole would push everything away. Pretty cool to think, right? While there isn't much evidence to support this, I would like to personally offer the scientific community my theory, because it's chetty. What if the Big Bang was created by a white hole, meaning the earliest of the universe's expansion could have been done by a white hole? Something to think about. You're welcome, science community, just doing my part. Number 6. The Fermi Paradox. In a nutshell, the Fermi Paradox states that the known universe is massive. It gets bigger each day. With all those millions and billions of stars and planets out there, you'd think someone would have come by in their flying saucer and said, hello. Well, that may not be the case because, well, we may be it. Personally, I believe there is life somewhere out there, but somewhere is really far away. It's so far, too far to even think about. It really hurts to think about how far away it is. But the Fermi Paradox argues that it would have happened by now, and the fact that it hasn't solidifies the scary and cold truth that we might be the only living and thinking creatures in a deep, dark, infinite void known as space. Man, that's heavy. Number 5. Planet X. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and sometimes Pluto. Depends if Neil deGrasse Tyson's in the room. He's not too cool about that one. He doesn't like that one. That's our little slice of cosmic life in the Milky Way galaxy. However, some scientists believe that there may be another large planet hiding out in the sun's orbit. Planet X, as it's been known to be called. Some think it's so large and mysterious that it has its gravitational effects even here on Earth, which is crazy because it's so far away. However, due to the theory stating its long orbit, we haven't seen it yet, or, you know, it's not there to begin with. There's also that possibility as well. Yes, it's fascinating, but we know that there's other planets beyond our solar system, so it could be there. It's really just really amazing to think about. Man, I love space. I love space stuff. Number 4, the moon landing. There are some out there who claim the moon landing never happened. It was faked, not real. It was a fugazi, says a guy with a tinfoil hat on his head drinking Mountain Dew in his mother's basement. While the folks who wear tinfoil have a point, there's tons of shady stuff surrounding the moon landing. There is, it's crazy. Especially to the average folks like you and me, it doesn't really add up. Missing recordings, footage being altered, light sources not matching up, and some claiming it was even done in a studio, which, hey, there's lots of magic done in the studio, like me right here, right now. Yeah. And one of their biggest claims to fame, or their big point, is that they never went back, which, well, that's just not true, because 24 US astronauts have been to the moon, 12 of which of those astronauts got to walk on the surface. The truth of the matter is, once you go up and pick up a few rocks, well, just not that special. It's little rocks on a big rock. Plus, with gas prices these days, can you imagine what it costs to fill up a booster rocket with space juice? Who's gonna front that bill? You guys gonna front that? I don't think so, man. That's too much money. Oh, hurts to think about. My wallet. Number 3, the multiverse. Ever been at the fork of the road and had to make a decision? Well, what if I told you every time you make a choice, you unknowingly create an alternate universe where you made the other choice? While this is just some mind-bending fun to think about by the campfire with your friends, it is actually a hypothesis that multiple universes exist just like in the Marvel movies. Pretty close, actually. Let's take one universe where there is Avengers, one where Thor isn't a gorgeous actor from down under, and maybe there's a universe where I'm good at math. Oh, I'd like to go to that one. That'd be kind of cool. I mean, who really knows? I don't. I wish I was good at math. I'd explain the quantum physics of it, but that's a job for smart me in another universe. You know what? It's probably universe 3.14 because of pi and math. That's smart. That's cute. Number 2, Roswell, New Mexico. Roswell, New Mexico, 1947. A UFO crash lands in the desert. Government agencies and the military quickly try to cover up what's happened. The crash debris is taken to Area 51 just to make a good story, and for years people claimed it was little green men and were being tested on at Area 51. What? Yeah, so much so that Roswell, New Mexico has now adopted aliens as their own identity. Pretty cool. And the conspiracy, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, sure. However, many years later it was declassified that it was actually just a weather balloon and it was nothing to be thought of that much, and they're just kind of crazy. Although, that's what the government would want you to think though, isn't it? Oh, sure. Number 1, nature finds a way. Okay, this one is cool. So basically, we're all made of the same stuff. No matter which way you look at it, we're all made of star stuff. And if the conditions on another planet were similar to ours, then there's quite the chance, or the probability, that nature would find a way. What do I mean by that? Well, it means that life would most likely be similar on other planets like ours, and not weird tentacle monsters with green skin and weirdos like we think aliens are. So that means if a deer on this planet is a deer, that means a deer on another planet could be very similar to a deer, or at least maybe even the same. Oh man, life always finds a way. That's crazy. That's insane. That's a crazy theory. You could run into other us. Wow.
Number 10 is the Pet Patrol. Do you guys remember the scene in Disney's Aladdin where he steals a piece of fruit and miraculously evades capture? Well, in real ancient Egypt, our prince wouldn't have stood a chance, as police in Egypt used baboons to catch thieves. Incredibly intelligent, these animals were able to be trained, which paired with their speed and ability to jump to places that are difficult for humans to reach, made them the perfect crime fighters. Baboons could also easily remember the face of any thief, as they are ranked 3rd in the animal world for their memory. So don't go relying on any luck to get away with anything. Outside of their police duties, they were treated incredibly kindly, but trained to participate in picking fruit, making beer, and even dancing. Baboons were so beloved by Egyptians that some mummies were later found to have tattoos of baboons on their bodies. In ancient Egyptian mythology, baboons are best known for their association with Thoth, the god of wisdom. However, they were linked to many other gods as well. Definitely nothing like Babu in Aladdin. But wait, did I say tattoo? Well, being inked up is no modern phenomena. Number 9 is tatted up tuts. Egyptians join indigenous, Nordic, African, and many other cultures of having a history of tattooing. Now, Egyptian tattooing was bizarre just because it was exclusive to only women. By tattooing in public regions of the body, the tattoos were intended to permanently mark the woman's association with religious worship, or on the flip side, they could also be used to symbolize the lower class and the mark of a dancing girl or a prostitute. That's what also makes it so bizarre. We can't really figure out why it was only women, what they meant, or what they symbolized beyond the vague generalization I just gave you. Tattooed mummies dating back to the 11th century dynasty have been found by archaeologists, some with religious symbolism, other with dots and swirls located on the lower chest, the abdominal, and the thighs. Some mummies were believed to have been tattooed with medical symbols, potentially to treat ailments. Although the meaning of ancient Egyptian tattoos may be unclear, it seems evident that they had an array of implications and that women of many different social classes chose to wear them. Baddies. Speaking of things we can't understand.
Number 8. One of many wars. Despite Walter Cronkite and Bob Hope's coverage of the war, and that's kind of a joke for people over the age of 60, Vietnam was a war in a series of armed conflicts during the Cold War. Yes, for Americans it was the most memorable to say the least, but there were many hot wars that took place during the Cold War. I'm not really sure how it got that name, but okay. The Vietnam War was a byproduct of the Cold War, just like these other wars and conflicts. For example, the Ethiopian Civil War, the Ogden War, the Dominican Civil War, the 6 Days War, just to name a few. Vietnam was the last time US forces would fully send troops on the ground like that for at least a few years. All the previous wars I mentioned were more the style of proxy wars. Basically, the United States and Soviet Union would vicariously fight through much smaller, less powerful nations. Basically, it's like getting your big brother to fight for your little brother. Number 7. Rainbow chemicals. Remember the last time when I talked about Agent Orange? Well, there was actually a whole rainbow of colored lethal chemicals used. Orange for trees, Agent Blue to destroy the rice supply, and a few other varieties and colors as well. They became known as the rainbow herbicides. The side effects effects of these chemicals were horrible, creating birth defects in children whose parents had been exposed. Many people still live with these conditions, and unfortunately, children born today still have birth defects. Clearly, this stuff is awful and should never be used again. I went to the chief's lab last night, and he took a look at the chemicals, and he said, that's not it. Number 6, Ho Chi Minh. The man behind the madness, or at least the communist revolution that he so desperately wanted to take over. Born in 1890 in what was then Indochina, a French colony, his beginnings of being a leader and anti-colonial views started quite young after being expelled from a school for such beliefs. He eventually found his way to France in 1919, where the Treaty of Versailles claimed Vietnamese freedom. His pleas, however, were not heard. A Japanese occupation during World War II and a rise in communism in the East was slowly adding ingredients for a revolution stew. Weird metaphor, but let's run with it. France, wanting to take back their colony, had started the Vietnam War. Now in charge of the communist revolution, it would be a decades-long fight with America and South Vietnam before claiming their bloody victory. Could have been prevented, that's crazy too. Like, he went to France and he's like, give us freedom. They're like, no, sacre bleu, you go back to where you came from. Number 5, Helicopter War. Probably the most iconic iconography of the war is the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, or better known as the Huey. The Vietnam War was the first war to see extensive use of helicopters, and honestly, I'm not sure how Americans would have fought the war without them. One of the main reasons the Viet Cong were successful was because they knew the land. They knew the jungle, and used many tactics to their advantage. Oftentimes, the jungle being their best weapon of defense itself. Even though chemicals and napalm were being used to help unjungle the jungle, it's the extensive use and effectiveness of the Huey helicopter that gave America the technological edge it so needed. For anyone that was actually there, I can just imagine the relief of soldiers that they must have felt when seeing those green beauties come barreling out of the sky. The helicopters turned out to be a great design and was used for many years after the Vietnam War. Number 4, draft dodging. Grade 12, what a great time to be alive. You're about to graduate. All your friends are excited about spending one last summer together before everyone goes off to college. Maybe you'll spend some time down at the beach, go hang out at the mall, or maybe you'll find a summer fling at a summer party. Nice. And just as you were about to put those bell-bottom jeans on, your mom says you got a letter. Oh no. You just got drafted into the Vietnam War, and it looks like you'll be spending your summer looking for a guy named Charlie in the jungle. That's weird, I wonder where he is. This was a reality for many young Americans who found themselves looking at a piece of paper that either meant they could die in a jungle or be in trouble with the law. However, when option A and B suck, go for C. In this case, that was draft dodging. Americans who received the mandatory volunteer letter fled in decently large numbers to other countries so Uncle Sam couldn't have his way. Many ended up here in Canada. Number 3, Napalm Girl. I briefly touched on this in the last part, but Kim Fantee deserves a moment of her own. There's a picture that made it out of the Vietnam War known as Napalm Girl. Well, Kim is that girl. Again, we cannot show you the image due to its graphic nature, but it's basically screaming Vietnamese children running down the road after a napalm strike near their location. Unfortunately for Kim, she was an innocent victim of total war. Her clothes were burned off and her skin was severely damaged by napalm, leaving her with scars and reminders of a horrible past. Almost 50 years later, she's still around to tell the story, and how she used faith and forgiveness to forgive those that caused so much pain and destruction to her country and herself. The photograph of Kim is probably the most infamous image of the war, and maybe the 20th century, and is a part of the media coverage that helped inspire Americans to pull out of the war. Number 2. I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. Good old Tricky Dick had just become president, and he had a plan to end the war in Vietnam, but first, they had to invade Cambodia. Why Cambodia? Well, basically the Viet Cong had this genius idea of moving war goods, materials, and troops on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but also moving through Cambodia, which at the time was neutral. The US just wasn't looking there at first. However, when it was realized it would be a tactical good decision to stop that from happening, for poor Tricky Dick, the invasion of Cambodia felt like he was furthering the war rather than trying to bring it to a close. To make matters worse, the Pentagon Papers were leaked, and it was discovered that America had increased involvement and not decreased. The people had had enough, and anti-war movements sparked across the country. It wasn't too long after this that they pulled out of Vietnam. and Cambodia. Number 1. The music. A lot can be said about the Vietnam War, but if sitting through history classes and watching some old movies doesn't paint the picture, then sit down and have a listen to the music that was made during the conflict. A lot to do with counterculture at the time. Once the Vietnam War went into second gear, art began to have its take on the Far East conflict. Books, movies, plays, but nothing more reachable and mainstream as music. The Doors, Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, and the classic CCR. If your thoughts of Vietnam don't feature Fortunate Son by CCR, is it really a thought about Vietnam? I say no. This is kind of disturbing, as when you compare to music one decade prior, it's completely different. Despite baby boomers causing havoc on minimum wage retail workers today, their music is pretty good and does a good job of depicting the emotions felt in such a grim situation. Yes, I love the music. I love the music of the American people.
In at number 10 is The Brethren, and it's way less cooler than it sounds. Living an almost Amish way of life, this pilgrim-esque cult is actually led currently by one of Forbes' richest men alive, who lives in a $5 million mansion while his followers aren't even allowed to travel outside of their communities. They have small sites around the world and follow some extreme expectations, such as men must work at their exclusive businesses, women stay at home. Brethrens are not permitted to eat at non-Brethren restaurants, stay in hotels, or even live in apartment buildings in a non-member neighborhood. They can't have a swimming pool or use a computer unless it was created and approved for Brethren use by a Brethren company. The internet is a pipeline to filth, so Brethren businesses provide cell phones and computers with a software called WordX that permits only word processing, spreadsheets, accounting programs, and email, but no internet. Women are only to dress from neck to wrist and neck to ankle coverage styles and have a ribbon or scarf in their overtly long hair. Men need to be clean shaven and dress in business casual. Brethren children are to live at home with their parents until the day that they are married. Typically the women get married young because their purpose is to be a dutiful wife and produce lots of children. The Brethren genuinely believe that those on the outside of the cult, especially those who left, are evil and living life wrong. Getting kicked out or withdrawn from in this community keeps members in check, as losing this lifestyle means being condemned to hell to them. It can be argued between their Messiah being a man of God figure that changes from one billionaire to another every so often, and their exclusive, strict, and elitist premises is that these qualities seem to be an antithesis of what religious movements are supposed to be. But I guess that's up to their eccentric billionaire god. In at number 9 is Crazy for Coconuts. It's a little confusing, but here goes. This German nudist dude, August Engelhardt, was so devoted to the consumption of coconuts that he started a cult about them. Loving nothing more than chafing sand and a good sunbird, Engelhardt loved sunlight and the tropics. So he started a group of like-minded individuals in Papua New Guinea. While the others were a little more normal at first, Engelhardt went hard and only consumed coconuts from day one. He was convinced that the sun was the source of all life, and the coconut, because it grew on top of palm trees closer to the sun than any other food, was clearly the best food in the world. He used his big fat inheritance to publish journals about his coconut beliefs in order to develop what he called the Order of the Sun, wherein members would worship the sun with him. It worked, mostly because it was his money that was shipping people out there. Free relocation to the tropics to eat fruit and dance nude under the sun. Come on, even I'd pack up, let's be real. Even at its peak, the cult never hit 100 members because they had a bad habit of, well, not surviving, only eating coconuts. There were no doctors, and this is an island known for venomous animals and potential illnesses that can be hard to treat. Accidents were also an issue, as many of these people had no idea how to navigate island living and were also physically weakened from, you guess it, only eating coconuts. Even Engelhardt was eventually wasting away from coconut exclusive dieting. He couldn't walk, was severely malnourished, afflicted with ulcers, he weighed under 100 pounds and was having seizures, all thanks to a diet of non-stop coconut and generally poor living conditions.
In our number 8 spot today, we have the Victorian bicycle craze. This is a name to refer to a period of intense enthusiasm for bicycles that swept across Europe and North America in the late 19th century. The introduction of the safety bicycle with its chain-driven mechanism and rubber tires made cycling a much more accessible activity for the general public. It became a popular mode of transportation and leisure activity, particularly among the middle and upper classes. The craze also had a significant impact on fashion, with women's clothing becoming more practical and comfortable to allow for cycling. It's funny to think of now because, like, it's just a bike, but at the time it was so much more than that. It's like how smartphones completely changed our lives in more ways than we probably even know. That's basically what the bike was like in the Victorian era. The bicycle
bicycle craze had a profound impact on society and culture at the time. It led to the development of new industries such as cycling clubs, and it also paved the way for the modern transportation industry. The bicycle became a symbol of freedom and empowerment, particularly for women who were able to travel further and faster than ever before. The Victorian bicycle craze remains an important cultural and historical phenomenon that changed the way people lived, worked, and played. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Crimean War. The Crimean War was a conflict fought between 1853 and 1856, primarily involving Russia and an alliance of France, Britain, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia. The war was fought over various territorial and religious disputes, particularly regarding the rights of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. The war was marked by high casualties, particularly from disease and poor medical care, and it is often seen as a turning point in military medicine. The war also featured some of the first extensive use of modern technologies such as telegraphs and railways, which greatly impacted warfare in the future. The war ended in a victory for the Allied forces, and it resulted in a significant shakeup of the balance of power in Europe. It also demonstrated the need for improved communication, organization, and medical care in military conflicts, and it had significant long-term impacts on military and political strategies in Europe and beyond. In our number 6 spot today, we have the East End outbreak. The East End outbreak was an outbreak of cholera in 1866 and was a major epidemic that struck the densely populated area of East London, causing widespread illness and death. Cholera is a highly contagious disease that spreads through contaminated water, and in the Victorian era, London's water supply was notoriously unsanitary. The outbreak was particularly devastating in the East End, where poverty and overcrowding made residents more vulnerable to disease. The outbreak led to significant changes in public health policy and infrastructure, as well as increased public awareness of the importance of sanitation and hygiene. The physician John Snow, which, feels like a weird name to say when I'm not talking about Game of Thrones, but the physician John Snow played a key role in identifying the source of the outbreak, tracing it to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street. His work really paved the way for the development of modern epidemiology and disease prevention. The East End cholera outbreak remains a significant event in the history of public health and the struggle for social justice. It brought attention to the urgent need for clean water and adequate sanitation, and it helped to spur reforms that improved the health and well-being of people in urban areas. In our number 5 spot today, we have the London Burglars. This is the name used to refer to a notorious of body snatchers who operated in London in the early 19th century. They were involved in the illegal trade of selling corpses to medical schools for dissection and study, and they would often resort to killings to obtain the bodies. The most infamous member of the gang was William Burke, who, along with his partner William Hare, committed a series of killings in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1828. They sold the corpses to the anatomist Robert Knox, who was unaware of their methods. Two of the group's members, John Bishop and Thomas Williams, were convicted of killings and sentenced to death. The London Burger scandal highlighted the demand for fresh corpses for medical research and contributed to the passage of the Anatomy Act of 1832, which allowed for the legal procurement of corpses for medical purposes. Emphasis on the legal part of that, though. It's important. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Great Stink of London. The Great Stink of London was an environmental disaster that occurred in the summer of 1858. It was caused by the city's inadequate sewage system, which allowed raw sewage and waste to be dumped directly into the River Thames. The hot weather only exacerbated the problem, which is disgusting, and it caused the sewage to ferment and emit a foul odor that permeated the city. The smell was so overwhelming that it caused widespread illness and forced many people to flee the city. Parliament was forced to act, and a major engineering project was launched to build a modern sewage system for London. This project was led by engineer Joseph Bazalgette, who designed a system of sewers and pumping stations that would carry sewage out of the city and into the Thames estuary. The construction of the new sewage system was a massive undertaking, involving the excavation of miles of tunnels and the construction of large pumping stations. It took several years to complete, but once it was finished,
established, it greatly improved the health and hygiene of the city. The Great Stink was a turning point in the history of public health, and it helped to spur major improvements in sanitation and public health infrastructure across the developed world. Today, the legacy of the Great Stink lives on in the modern sewer systems and wastewater treatment facilities that are really essential for maintaining public health and environmental quality. In our number 3 spot today, we have Typhoid Mary. The Typhoid Mary case is a famous incident in the history of public health in the United States. Mary Mallon, also known as Typhoid Mary, was an asymptomatic carrier of the bacteria that causes typhoid fever, a potentially fatal disease. Despite being unaware of her condition, Mary inadvertently infected numerous people during her work as a cook in New York City in the early 1900s. After a number of typhoid outbreaks were traced back to Mary's cooking, she was tracked down and forcibly quarantined for several years. The case generated significant controversy at the time, with some arguing that Mary's civil rights had been violated and others maintaining that public safety justified her isolation. The Typhoid Mary case remains significant for its implications for public health policy and for the balance between individual rights and public safety. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Birmingham riots. These riots took place in 1839, and they were a series of violent clashes that occurred in the city of Birmingham, England. The riots were sparked by tensions between two groups: the Chartists, who were calling for political reform and greater democratic representation, and the authorities, who opposed the movement. On July 4th, 1839, a group of Chartists held a rally in Birmingham's Bull Ring, where they were met with opposition from local government agencies. The situation quickly escalated into violence, with protesters and authorities engaging in brutal clashes that lasted for several days. The Birmingham riots of 1839 were significant for their role in the history of the Chartist movement, and it is said that the events of 1839 demonstrated the lengths to which authorities were willing to go to suppress the movement. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have the Brown Dog Affair. This was a controversy that arose in the early 20th century in London over the use of animals in medical research. In 1903, a statue of a brown dog was erected in Battersea, which had been used in vivisection experiments by a scientist named William Bayliss. If you're unfamiliar, vivisection is defined as, quote, the practice of performing operations on live animals for the purpose of experimentation or scientific research. While I am all for the advancement of science, I do believe in ethical studies, and this clearly was not that. The statue was intended as a memorial to the countless animals that had been used in medical research, but it was met with outrage from some people. Anti-vivisection groups saw it as a symbol of animal cruelty, while some medical researchers saw it as an attack on their work. In 1907, a group of medical students attacked the statue during a protest, sparking a violent confrontation with anti-vivisection activists. The statue was eventually removed by authorities, but the controversy continued to rage on for many years. The Brown Dog Affair highlighted the deep divisions in society over the use of animals in medical research and contributed to the development of new laws and regulations aimed at protecting animal welfare.
Number 10. Albert. Adam, how is Queen Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert bizarre? Well, my little honeybees, not to be a pessimist, but it's bizarre because they actually really did love each other. Be honest, how often do you think it occurred that people of royal or noble birth actually got to marry someone they genuinely loved? On February 10th, 1840, Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, who, interestingly, was her first cousin, and who was actually kind of not the favorite of the British people who saw him as an outsider. As queen, she was the one to propose. Good for you, Queen. Literally. The couple stayed married for 21 years until Albert died of typhoid in 1861, and together the couple had 9 children. 9. Even after his death, Queen Victoria continued to make ruling decisions based on the principle of what would Albert do? Such a nice way to start this heinous list.
Number 9. Napoleonic Wars. Okay, a little bit of a stretch, but I would argue the Victorian era lasted from about 1814 to 1914. There's no specific date, but it could be classified around this time. The Napoleonic Wars were essentially world wars started by one man, the Corsican ogre. Hello. Imagine having the whole world against you. No, really, the whole world. against you. Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and sometimes Italy took part in the coalition wars, which were just part of Napoleon's story. Trust me, this dude was arrogant and he was the antagonist of the story. He's been labeled as the greatest tactician ever. When it was all said and done, he had rediscovered ancient Egypt, fought many battles, and managed to become emperor. And he got banished twice.
Number 8, clown shoes. For some reason, people were really into long shoes back in the day. Really long toes. The longer your shoes were, apparently the more refined you were considered to be. Look at these very long-toed shoes. I can't even walk in these. So hence why people tried to get the longest shoes around to wear. Apparently the shoes were so long at one point that they actually had to be reinforced with whalebone. I don't know about you, but I've worn long pointed-toed shoes before, once or twice, and just even having a toe that is honestly like an inch or two longer than, you know, what I would normally be wearing makes it horrifyingly hard to walk around in. I was scuffing my toes left, right, and center. But I guess if you were really wealthy back in the day, you ideally wouldn't have to walk at all. So would this be a problem? I don't know. I would hopefully have someone carrying me around, I guess, or put me on a carriage or something. Number 7, prayer test. I personally think I would fail this test really hard, even being a good public speaker and even someone that reads avidly. Basically, the prayer test was used to figure out if you were a witch by checking to see if you could read the Bible. This was also usually something that was done publicly, so if you were nervous, scared, or worried about your trial, or just if you struggled to read, like so many did back then and some still do today, you were in trouble. The idea was that witches would not be able to read the holy words because they were witches, so they'd be like, I can't read that, God is taking away my power. That's why this existed. While like many trials it was used as proof of someone being a witch, on the other hand, if you passed this test with flying colors, it also didn't mean that you were innocent, so you're not off the hook yet. So yeah, I mean, I guess classic witch trials, am I right? Classic tests. Oh, you passed with flying colors? Well, you can still be a witch. We don't know about that. We gotta do more tests. Do the pricking test. Let's do this test. Dunk them in the water. Number 6, the dancing plague. To this day, people still don't know what caused the dancing plague to happen, which is pretty scary and strange. We only know that it did happen in 1518 and potentially a few other times earlier on throughout the medieval ages. What happened? Well, people started to spontaneously dance and then tragically spontaneously die. Some of them died from heart attacks, some dropped dead from exhaustion, being unable to stop dancing, but what we don't really know, even to this day, is why. There are a few leading theories though. One is food poisoning. I gotta say, this one sounds the most likely to me. Not just any kind of food poisoning are we talking about here. We are talking about a fungal type of food poisoning that actually could have resulted in people getting dosed involuntarily with a hallucinogenic. Another theory is mass hysteria, and another still, although one that I think is the most odd and honestly unlikely, is that people were basically forced to dance because of religious reasons. It sounds unlikely to me, however there are cases of this happening, so maybe it's not that unlikely. Sometimes people were apparently forced to dance non-stop as punishment for their sins. Honestly, a pretty exhausting and terrible punishment if you ask me. I mean, fun to start, we all like to dance to start, but when you have to dance for a whole year or something, that would quickly become the worst thing ever, I imagine. And of course, you might not survive that punishment because dancing, it exhausts you. Number 5, marriage. Many people have this idea of lavish weddings being a huge thing in the medieval ages, and while that was eventually the case, the fact remains that it wasn't entirely true, at least not at the start. In fact, weddings actually became this big ordeal because people became confused about who was married and who wasn't, with people actually not even needing permission back in the day to get married and simply needing to exchange basically a little vow to be considered wed. And because that could happen just about anywhere, private or public, it became very hard for people to keep track of, which is why we had to have a whole to-do about it. And it's also why people had to witness the consummation of marriages. That was also part of people just being like, you know what, we just gotta make sure this is happening. Yikes. Number 4, animals on trial. One of the strangest things by far to have happened in the medieval ages was the persecution of animals. Among them, pigs were apparently the most likely to be put on trial, and sadly, many were actually convicted of the crimes that they were accused of. At one point, a pig was even dressed up as a human for its own execution. I feel like that's kind of fitting considering really humans were the criminals here, I'm sure, in this case, so why not make the pig look like a human if you're going to convict it of a crime, you know what I mean? Really, who are the criminals on Earth? I feel like we're probably those people. No animals were seemingly exempt in France, even dolphins were apparently put on trial, and I've heard stories of lawyers waiting for their clients, the rats, to attend court, only to be frustrated when they didn't show up to trial. Like, hey, we called those rats, we sent them a letter. What, rats can't read now all of a sudden? Oh, isn't that convenient? If rats ever been able to read, how would sending them a letter to summon them to court? It's so ridiculous. I know being a lawyer back in the day probably didn't carry with it quite the same prestige as it does now, but just imagine becoming a lawyer only to have to defend a rat on trial being accused of eating crops. Man, you'd be like, why did I become a lawyer again? I wonder how they decided which lawyer gets that case too. I don't know, probably like you're the least experienced one and they're like, sorry, you're gonna have to do the rat trial. Ugh. Number 3, courtly love. This one is shocking in kind of a nice way, so I thought I'd include it here to provide some levity and surprise you about some of the things from the medieval ages that actually sound, well, I mean, kinda nice. While more physical intimacy was of course saved for marriage, love was also believed to be something that could be shared among multiple partners. Now in court, there was a type of love that was known as courtly love, which was all about celebrating the love of friends and those close to us in even a romantic sense. There were even rules made up for how to do courtly love properly. These are the rules of courtly love, this is how we do it. One of the rules even read, marriage is no real reason for not loving. Honestly, true. Super adorable. Acknowledging that most marriages were forged for political or monetary reasons and not for love, with courtly love you could basically hold hands, dance, and even laugh with other people outside of your marriage. It was basically the people at court being like, yeah, we know that none of us are married to each other because we actually like each other. Of course, you still couldn't sleep with your courtly love partners. That was still forbidden and considered a sin. But even the idea of loving someone outside of marriage, even by today's standards, might seem taboo or unheard of. Especially if we're talking about people like holding hands and giggling together. Yet back then, it was actually just part of the courtly lifestyle, which in a weird way is kind of progressive. Number 2, the Children's Holy Crusade. If you're thinking about the Holy Crusade and also thinking that it doesn't seem like something children should be involved in, you would be right. But here we are. This was actually a holy crusade that was attempted to be started by a child. Although to be accurate, back in the medieval ages there were many living adult lives who by today's standards would still be considered kids. However, even with that context, keeping that in mind, this is still a pretty wild and terrible story, I gotta say. There was a boy named Stephen who was apparently 12 at the time that led this crusade, or attempted to anyways. When he went to King Philip of France seeking support and claiming that he had been spoken to by Jesus Christ himself and told to go on this holy mission to the Holy Land, Philip refused to aid Stephen and instead told him, hey Stephen, you know what, maybe you should go home. You're only 12, man. But despite not getting royal or adult support, Stephen did not stop. He continued on, gaining another child leader to his cause by the name of Nicholas. Apparently thousands of kids joined them both on their mission, although it's believed very few, if any, actually made it to the Holy Lands. We still don't really know what ended up happening to all the members of this crusade, the thousands of them, though it is believed many of them never made it back home to tell the tale of their adventure. So, pretty terrible. How did we just be like, yeah, go for it? I don't know. Seems like a weird thing. I guess everyone was saying go for it, the kids were just doing their own thing. Number 1, corpses on trial. If you thought putting animals on trial was ridiculous and inhumane, well you're definitely right. Guess what? It somehow gets weirder than that. In this case, Pope Stephen VI decided one day to put the previous pope, Pope Formosus, on trial. The problem? Pope Formosus was not only already excommunicated at this point, but he was also very dead. The trial went down in history as one of the most ridiculous trials ever and ended up with Pope Stephen finding Formosus guilty, stripping him of the clothes he was basically buried in, removing his blessing fingers, and reburying him. Only to change his mind, unbury him, and then toss him into the Thames. Needless to say, Pope Stephen's reign did not last even a full year, and by the end of it he himself was also dead, having been mysteriously strangled after being imprisoned. I wonder why. I wonder who did that.
Number 10. Eleanor Rigby's. Now the song is going to be stuck in your head all day. You're welcome for that. Hit that thumbs up for Eleanor Rigby. Back in 1957, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, they both met at a party in St. Peter's Church in Wilton. But just yards away from where they met, where they were standing, was the actual real-life grave of the real-life Eleanor Rigby. 9 years later, McCartney wrote the song Eleanor Rigby. Now, see, originally he had claimed that he named the character, or the song rather, after the actress Eleanor Brown and a store in Bristol, Rigby and Evans. He got the name from those two specific inspirations. But then later on, he admitted that the grave may have played a subliminal part in his song's namesake. He's out there having some wine, he looks down, sees Eleanor Rigby, and he's like, duly noted, duly noted. That's happened before. Regardless, the deed to Miss Rigby's grave was auctioned off, but then failed to sell. Rather a dark story. Yeah, so pretty fun song with some rather dark, sad history. Number 9. My Way. Frank Sinatra's My Way, another song that'll be stuck in your head now. There you go. You're welcome again. It's a classic. We've all hummed this song at some point. Now, Frank released the song in 1969 and it spent 75 weeks as a top 40 hit. Even today, it's still a classic, right? Sinatra's greatest hits and his legacy lasted a while, but things got suspicious starting in the early 2000s. Specifically in the Philippines, things got a little crazy over there. Bad things happen to people who sing My Way. Apparently that's just the rule now. Between 2002 and 2012, around a dozen people were all in connection one way to another to the song My Way. One of those 12 people was for singing the song out of tune, which is, I mean, come on, like really? People are insane. These karaoke attacks all happened during that song, when it was playing, sometime before or after, you name it. Now the song has since been removed from many playlists due to its bad juju. So if you're thinking of having a karaoke night with your friends, maybe show them this list first and then make some options after that.
Number 8. Hell hath no fury. The Roman Empire was just about good at everything. Politics, culture, building a city that would stand the test of time, and eventually outlive their civilization. But perhaps the Romans' strongest attribute was their military. I mean, come on, it's Rome, no introduction is needed here. So when a man was worried that the Romans he had worked with might take over his homeland after he had passed, he left a note in his will saying, "Please do not take this. This is mine, don't take it." I'll give the folks at home a second to think about what the Romans did next. If you guessed annex his homeland and do non-YouTube friendly conduct things to his wife and daughter, you'd be correct. His wife Boudica, not feeling so cool about what happened, took some action by gathering the tribe together and revolting against the Romans. Defeating the scrambled Romans in a battle, she then made her way to Londinium, or what's now London, and had it burned. There were empires that couldn't take down the Roman Empire, and Boudica did it like it was nothing. They did end up losing and, once again to avoid capture, drank poison. But come on, she took down the Romans. Number 7. Viva la Revolucion. Juana de Paria was born in Spanish-controlled Peru to two loving parents. Like many classic stories, her mother sadly passed away when she was young, where she grew very attached to her father. Although unusual for the time, her father instructed her on how to horse ride and sharpshoot. Even helped her father work during the days. They were pretty tight, but like an M. Night Shyamalan movie, there's a double twist. Her father passed away in her teens. Now an orphan, she was forced to move in with her aunt, where she quite possibly developed the very first feelings of teenage angst before there was ever an Avril Lavigne album. Juana would often have outbursts that got her eventually sent to become a nun, where that also did not go very well. During her studies, she was fond of Joan of Arc, but eventually she was expelled at a young age of 17. After years of witnessing colonial reign, she joined the revolution. She became so passionate about the cause, she once fought a battle while pregnant, went back to have a baby, and then went back to battle with the baby strapped to her back. Man, sometimes I don't even want to get up after a large meal. What a woman! Number 6. Not one step back. Ludmila Pavlichenko was just like any other girl in Russia in the 1940s. She was in her last year of university when history's favorite mustache man invaded history's second favorite mustache man. Feeling inspired by her country's call to arms, she signed up for military service. She would eventually find her way to be a sharpshooter. During the siege of Odessa, she is credited with 187 confirmed kills. She married a fellow sniper, he died, then she went on to have over 300 confirmed kills when the war was over. Once the military realized how valuable she was pulled from the front lines, where she became key propaganda for Russia. She would also find herself training young snipers up until the end of the war. She was oftentimes referred to as the Lady of Death. Number 5. The Limping Lady. World War II was the cause and effect for a lot of things. If you like spies and espionage, it's kinda where it all started. One of the best spies who did more than her fair share was Virginia Hall, a lady with a peg leg who thwarted German plans again and again, with her sidekick and peg leg nicknamed Cuthbert. She was credited by top German officials as being the most dangerous spy of all time. In one OSS report, her team is credited with destroying 4 bridges, derailing a freight train, and neutralizing 150 enemies, with hundreds more captured. Now, I'm not a world-class detective or anything, but I feel like if you're trying to find the female spy with a peg leg, it isn't that hard, on account of, some pretty specific identifying features. I don't know how you messed it up. Where is the lady? Where is her? And you hear her walking down the hall. She got a peg leg. What do you mean? Number 4. Miss General. Fu Hao was one of 60 wives to Emperor Wu Ding, which I'm not sure even Mormons can figure that out. But to avoid obscuring into the background like TV's least favorite sister wife, she took control. According to records, she led many successful military campaigns and commanded an army of 13,000. While stories of the past can get lost, this is most likely true, as her tomb was full of many different weapons like great axes, which was common to bury distinguished generals with at the time. When I'm buried as a warrior princess, I want my collection of pop figures to come with me. I spent too much time on those bad boys to not take them with me to the afterlife. Number 3. Fatality. Tamiris was the queen of Mazagate, or at least I think that's how it's pronounced, a confederation of nomadic tribes that lived east of the Caspian Sea. She ruled during the 6th century BC and is most famous for her vengeful war she waged against the Persian king Cyrus the Great. At first, the war wasn't going too great. Unfortunately, her son claimed his life out of shame for losing in battle. Mom was not happy and promised the bloodiest battle ever. Well, she wasn't lying. As the promised battle was very bloody, many Persians perished in battle, including Cyrus. When his body was recovered, the vengeful queen harnessed the power of mid-90s fighting games and removed his head and turned his skull into a cup and proclaimed, "Drink your fill of blood." Nice. Number 2. The Beautiful Samurai. What does it mean to be a samurai? Armor, a kick-ass sword, and a code of honor? Yes, it does. And Tomoe Gozen did it all and had time to look good doing it. Tomoe Gozen's life is shrouded in mystery and many debate her existence, but whatever be the case, she did leave a mark on history. A very red-stained mark on history. Earning the respect of the men around her, it was stated that she had long black hair and a fair complexion and was in command of a large number of men. However, her biggest claim to fame, when she was approached by multiple foes, she rode right at them, grabbing their leader and liberating his head from his shoulders. Wow, you slay it, queen. Number 1. Who else could it go to but the Maid of Orleans? All the badass women who went through a lot on this list, they seen some stuff, honey. But Joan of Arc, girl, she takes the cake. Joan was born a poor peasant but had a unique gift. She could speak to the gods. And the gods told her it was her time to shine. By the time she was 19, she had led thousands of men to battle and in glorious victory. Charles VII, losing the 100 Years' War at the time, said, "Alright, sure, send the girl to fight. What have we got to lose?" Well, they actually had a lot to win. Once Joan had gotten involved, the French began to win victory after victory, and her claims of being guided by God didn't seem so far-fetched after all. The British, being so shaken up by the young girl's military prowess, thought she had been possessed by the devil. The British, not liking losing war to a teenage girl, decided to treat her with compassion by keeping her warm with a fire while she was tied to a wooden post. Joan would later become a legend for her efforts, because getting burned at the stake is honestly a lot and I can't even deal. Number 10. Crying Wolf. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a conflict between Vietnam and US forces in 1964. What's messed up about that is that 2 days later, it happened again. Actually, it didn't. Big prank. The second incident was fabricated by the US just to justify ramping up their presence in Vietnam. Sadly, it worked, as the next 8 years in Vietnam would end up being a total snipe storm for the US, as they would encounter problems abroad and at home. Thank goodness this is the only time the American government would ever lie about anything ever again, right? This was officially declassified decades later. Number 9. Agent Orange. The world agreed not to use chemical warfare after the First World War, as it was extremely cruel and lethal. So, you might be surprised that America used chemical weapons during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange, brought to you by the Dow Chemical Company, was a herbicide and defoliant dropped and sprayed from air vehicles to cut down the thick jungle brush. Viet Cong soldiers were excellent at living off the land and concealing themselves in the jungle. Bad guy hides in jungle, you remove the jungle. Makes sense. The chemical was extremely effective, but what's so messed up was the negative health side effects. Soldiers that were exposed to the chemical developed cancers years after the war. But what's even more crazy is how it affected the Vietnamese people. It created children with really bad health defects, and to this day there are many people who live with ill side effects of Agent Orange. That's just not right, man. That's wrong. That is so wrong, dude.
Number 8, the isolator. Alright, a little different, but still definitely weird. This image may seem haunting at first, but it's actually quite ahead of its time. The isolator came long before noise-canceling headphones or lo-fi beats to study and relax to. This goofy-looking helmet was intended to block out noise and finally allow you to concentrate on finishing that Victorian-era paper due the next day. Now, this was back in the early to mid-1900s when inventor Hugh Gernsback worked hours and hours to create this study buddy to block out distractions in life. Now, this is a powerful image because the things that distract us today, like Instagram, Messenger, dating apps, YouTube, none of those things were even a concept back in 1925 when this device was revealed to the public. So you can only imagine what we need now, right? We need like the ultimate isolator. It's just a motorcycle helmet. It's just Daft Punk's helmet turned off, really. That's all we need. Number 7, Mary Pickford. Now, I mentioned earlier how these celebrity scandals often came from their love life, and then they have to, maybe there's some stuff happening, maybe they were arguing before, that changes the game. Everyone cares about who's dating who and who's divorcing who. I mean, look how often we bring up Pete Davidson today. I mean, how's the guy doing it? Really, how's he doing it? Now, as hard as it is, we can't judge people off a headline or a scandal or whatever we see. We don't know the full story at all, regardless of what it looks like or what we want it to look like. The silent film star divorced her husband, Owen Moore, around the 1920s, and then she married a man named Douglas Fairbanks right after. Now, when I say right after, I mean less than a month right after. Like Pete Davidson's speed. I'll admit that would interest me as well. I'd have my own opinion. Sure. Now, the public, at first, they weren't happy with Mary Pickford. They made assumptions about how long this affair had been going on. Oh, she was married. How could she? Yada, yada, yada. Her career was actually on the line because of this scandal, and that was until Owen Moore was confirmed to be a not so great guy. Turns out throughout their marriage, he was a towards Mary. So she went from being almost canceled with no job to the most courageous for telling her story, how the tides have turned. Number 6, portable holding cell. Prisoner transport is always a risky game, right? I have YouTube, I see some stuff that goes on online, it's crazy. When out in public in any way, the odds that something goes wrong or they escape back into the real world and run away, it goes up significantly. The movie Con Air is about this exact situation unfolding. A timeless classic. Nicolas Cage, so good. Dave Chappelle's in that too, wild. Well, back in the 1920s, we didn't have SWAT teams move around the worst of the worst. Instead, we had bike cops with cages. It's pretty funny. This portable jail cell is an early version of our modern day police car. The concept was perfect, but the fact that this guy is sitting in a cell and could just grab the officer on the bicycle at any given moment, that's not so ideal. The fact that he's less than a foot away, that's not relaxing at all. Would you ever ride in one of these? I can barely do a sidecar in a motorcycle, let alone pegs on a bike. I don't know. If I'm not riding, I'm not on the bike, ever. Number 5, the Prohibition era. The Prohibition era was a time where there were restrictions placed on the consumption of alcohol, which of course was done with a ban being placed on the production, importation, transportation, whatever portation, and sale of alcohol by the US government, all from 1920 to 1933. A real boring time. Not really, no one listened to it. Of course, this ban certainly didn't stop people from producing or consuming alcohol, it was just done in sneakier, unsafer ways. The black market for alcohol was booming as people began to drink redistilled industrial alcohol instead of, normal drinkable stuff. This is all pretty well known, but one super sketchy thing that's not widely known is something that the government agencies did to curb the black market sales. They poisoned the industrial alcohol on purpose that was being repurposed for drinking. So, yeah, some villain stuff right there. Not just poison in a way where the consumer would get sick and maybe not want to drink it anymore, which is already horrendous enough, but they poisoned the alcohol with lethal chemicals. It is thought that by the time that Prohibition ended, at least 10,000 people died from this act alone. This event is still one of the strangest and deadliest decisions made by government officials today. I mean, cut to today, everything's legal now it seems, but there was a time where it wasn't. Number 4, not every state. Being a Canadian, at least, we're seeing things become legal all of a sudden, and that's weird. I'm 28 years old and I'm like, what? This is legal now? Okay, that's weird. It's odd, but we saw this happen in Prohibition as well. Many governors at the time refused to throw away money towards enforcing or policing this alcohol ban. Maryland, for example. Okay, Maryland never even enacted the enforcement code in the first place and eventually earned a reputation as the most stubborn anti-prohibition state in the Union. Nice. New York followed and repealed its measures in 1923, and slowly but surely, it all just went away. But some states did the opposite. They were all for the ban. Yeah, nerds. Kansas and Oklahoma remained dry until 1948 and 1958, and Mississippi remained alcohol-free until 1966. That's like 33 years after the passage of the 21st Amendment. Like, guy, can we click refresh? Can we move on? I'm very thirsty. Thank you. Number 3, the Kensington system. All right, Queen Victoria. Let's talk about you a little bit. Victoria was brought up under the Kensington system, which if you haven't heard of it before, it's pretty awful. Yeah, I thought I was grounded growing up. This is... Whew. Victoria's mother, Duchess Victoria of Kent, created this Kensington system to control her daughter's life. I mean, she literally isolated this child from friends or family members, you name it. Her mother did this all to keep her pure. This system sounds awful. Her mother would monitor her every single action, including who she can see or even speak to. Victoria only had 2 friends growing up her entire life. She had her half-sister, Princess Feodora of Lenin, and the Duchess attendant, Sir John Conroy. Oh, and the Duchess's attendant, Sir John Conroy, well, his daughter, Victoria. 2 friends your entire life. That's awesome. I mean, I only had 3 friends growing up, but 2, that's just cruel. She shared a room with her mother until she was queen. She literally couldn't walk down the hall to go to the washroom without her mother being by her side. Victoria has reflected on her childhood, and she said that she hated John Conroy for manipulating her mother. She actually referred to him as demon incarnate. That's a hefty burn from Victoria. Number 2, Al Capone's brother. What's going on with that guy during the Prohibition era? What's the other side of the family doing this whole time? We don't hear about him. Siblings can be the exact same. My brother and I were the same person pretty much. Al Capone and his brother, they had to separate a little bit. They had to play different paths for a bit. Not homies for a bit, it seems. A little different. Al Capone's oldest brother was a prohibition enforcement agent. Yeah, how ironic is that? Al built a criminal empire built on illegal liquor in Chicago back in the 1920s, but Vincenzo, the eldest of the 6 Capone brothers, he had changed his name to Richard Joseph Hart, of course to hide his identity, and after working for a bit in the circus, Vincenzo settled in Homer, Nebraska in 1922, and eventually he was a special officer assigned to investigate bootlegging. Now after he lost his badge on suspicion of theft, Vincenzo reunited with the Capone family in 1940. He met back up with Al in Miami and started to get in on that family cash that he's been missing out on. And finally, number 1, ice mask. Today you can go on Amazon and get a therapeutic gel face mask for like $20. If you're stressed out or trying to avoid puffy eyes, bam, throw this in the freezer for a hot minute and you're set, just like that. You can make your own aloe vera honey gel mask if you feel like. Just click any vlogger that says the word wellness in their bio and well, good luck. Back in the 40s, Hollywood makeup artist Max Factor Jr. created the first ever face mask to reduce facial puffiness. Yeah, what a magician. And it looked way cooler too. Again, pun intended. They didn't use freezer gels back then, instead just, well, a bunch of ice cube shaped containers that froze individually on your face. It was an ice cube tray mask, rather. It was actually invented to fight hangovers. That's one of the main reasons. How fun is that? Now, it's a shame that this design never got, caught on because the ones today, they're no good. They're too cute. They're not cold enough or big enough. Imagine busting this mask out during a lecture. Imagine having this underneath the isolator. You could do anything you wanted. You can invent anything you wanted. I don't know, sound off below.
Number 10, Flat Earth. Oh baby, it's bizarre, alright. Listen, I'm not gonna pretend to be a scientist or anything cause, well, truth be told, I'm the farthest thing from it. Really, if you looked at it, I'm nowhere close to a scientist. My science education goes about as far as high school, and even that's debatable because the teacher who was, well, teaching me chemistry was a newfie. Nicest guy on planet Earth, but I have no idea what the hell he was talking about half the time. Literally, I have no idea. But I learned enough to get by, so I can more than confidently tell you that the Earth is in fact not flat. That's right, not flat. There is no ice wall, there is no global conspiracy of all the world's nations. While we could probably agree that the government or everyone's governments are hiding something, it most certainly isn't the knowledge that the Earth is flat. They're definitely not hiding that. That's not what they're hiding. Lastly, if Earth is flat, then why are the other planets, moons, and other celestial bodies in our solar system round or spherical. We're flat, but everyone else is round and spherical? That just don't make any sense, partner. Number 9, Operation Paperclip. At the end of World War II, Americans were strolling through Germany one day and saw some really cool stuff. V-2 rockets, to be specific. Ooh, cool. And they said to themselves, ooh, yes please, I would like some of those for myself and the rest of America, thank you. So they rounded up some not so nice gentlemen who were in a lot of hot water and brought them back to America where, well, they helped develop military technology, but more importantly, rocket technology. This was all thought to be a crazy story, but it turns out to be true. Who would have thought? All about space. Like Werner von Braun, for example. Not so nice German guy, but was keen helping NASA develop rocket technology that got us to the moon. Yeah, he did. That's how it happened. That's life. Operation Paperclip. Number 8. French Indochina. The US was not the first superpower trying to tame Vietnam. Vietnam used to be called French Indochina, and it used to be a colony of France. And when they no longer wanted to be a part of that, France came down to give them a piece of their minds. But you can probably guess how that went, considering the US was there 20 years later trying to do the same thing. While France was trying to keep a colony and the US was trying to stop communism from spreading to other countries, Vietnam was trying to fight for its independence, which is ironic for America because that's how they became a country. And yes, I know that the communist movement in Vietnam wasn't great by any standards, but the regime America was trying to put in place was no better. As much as France would have liked to keep Vietnam, times were changing and there was no victory in sight with or without American support. Number 7. Well, that escalated quickly. Up until 1967, the war was bad. But it was nothing compared to what was going to happen in 1968. In 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a massive military campaign designed to destroy the foreign invaders. All across the country, key targets were being attacked, and it seemed overnight that the war went from a 6 all the way to an 11. What's so messed up though is even though the VC did not achieve major victories, it was costing a lot of American lives. With the Viet Cong using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the war not only escalated in Vietnam, but had reached neighboring nations like Cambodia. This had an effect on the war back home. The US thought and told people it would be a quick war. They had the advantage. But after the VC flexing their military might, it was clear that more US soldiers would be needed to win the war, which some people were beginning to question in the first place. And as time went on, most people would protest America's involvement. Number 6. A terrible loss of life. The Vietnam War is one of the most important events in US history, and honestly world history too. It was a very hot war during the Cold War, which we could do a whole video on that itself. A time of superpowers ready to annihilate one another at the push of a red button. Thousands of young men volunteered or were drafted to fight in a war that would humble the very powerful country. 58,141 Americans would lose their lives in order to contain communism. Of that 61%, they were under the age of 21. That is an insane, I can't even believe that. The Vietnamese lost over 300,000 people in the conflict. The war is remembered for being a tragic loss of life, and the domino theory that communism would spread throughout the world if containment was not initiated didn't happen, as most countries today just aren't communist. Number 5. Civil rights. If you know the 1960s, then you know it was a decade of change. A lot of history to unfold in just 10 years. Again, we could probably do a whole video on that. The Vietnam War is especially important towards the civil rights movement, as black Americans were a big part of the war effort in Vietnam. Black soldiers were nothing new to the American military, but their integration with white soldiers was. Every war previous, soldiers of different skin color were separated into different units. While most soldiers got along, there was still a long way to go, as black soldiers were still often mistreated. It seemed, however, that in a war zone, white Americans and black Americans were fine, but at home had tensions. We could do a whole video on civil rights and segregation, but to sum it up, racial relations made Americans ask questions. And for black Americans, the question is, how is someone expected to fight a war in a foreign country that we really have no business being in, for a country that won't allow a certain group of citizens to even buy a cup of coffee because they're not allowed to enter the building due to the color of their skin? Just doesn't make sense, man. Number 4. Mattel 16. The 1960s saw a lot of technological development. The extensive use of the helicopter comes to mind. During the early years of the Vietnam War, Americans were issued a brand new rifle. The M16 was a brand new design that flopped as hard as it could. as it tended not to work, which, if you're in a war, is kind of not what you want to happen. Your stuff's kind of gotta work. A rumor had spread around that the firearm never needed to be cleaned, which in a jungle setting with mud and rain just doesn't make any sense. This, with already existing flaws, made it jam and was rendered useless by soldiers. Nicknamed the Mattel 16 after the toy company, some soldiers were forced to use enemy weapons, which sadly in some cases may have led to fatal incidents of friendly fire. Number 3. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Another very useful tool in destroying the Vietnamese jungle. Trees are made of wood, and wood burns, so set them ablaze. Except napalm is different. A chemical compound meant to burn at a very hot temperature of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it would burn for a while. This was used in multiple ways, but probably the most effective with airstrikes. While not the first time firebombing had been used, as it was proven effective in the firebombing of Japan during World War II, the Vietnam War saw almost the same amount of ordnance dropped, napalm and others included, as used in all of World War II by America. That is an insane statistic. It had a terrible effect on people, as it can burn skin off. The most infamous picture from the Vietnam War had something to do with this. We can't show it to you, but you've probably honestly seen it already. The military would later disband its use, as the ability to control napalm's destructive power is limited. Number 2. GI Kebab. While the Viet Cong may not have won many battles against the US, they were still formidable fighters. They had the lay of the land and laid traps everywhere. From 1965 to 1970, 11% of American casualties were related to Viet Cong placed traps. What's so messed up in that is that in a modern war with modern technology, a lot of the traps the Viet Cong were using were something out of the Stone Age, but still deadly. Improvised explosives, swinging spiked balls, tripwires, single shot cartridges, and snake pits right out of Indiana Jones. I can't even believe that's real. But the most effective were punji pits, or punji sticks. A large hole is dug and bamboo spikes are placed at the bottom. Then, out of pure evil, urine or human excrement is put on the spikes. A thin layer of leaves or cover is placed on the trap, so when someone comes along they would fall in a pit of spikes that if that didn't kill them, an infection from the waste would, or make recovery very, very miserable. That is cruel, man. That ain't right, man. That ain't right, Chief. Number 1. Apocalypse Now. Tiger Force was a long-range reconnaissance unit that later became known for its acts of war crimes. Not sure if there could be war crimes when everyone's doing naughty things, but okay. To quote Martin Sheen in Apocalypse Now, charging someone with murder around here is like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500. And like a scene right out of that movie, the members of Tiger Force had a tradition to make necklaces out of ears. I'm going to say that again. They made necklaces out of ears. There are a number of things Tiger Force committed that are honestly just not safe for life. But that's war at the end of the day. War is hell. Number 10. Live long enough to become the villain. Saigon isn't Saigon anymore, and while many great efforts were made to thwart the Viet Cong, the finger quote good guys lost. There's a little bit of irony in the story, however. Think about it for a second. America was a colony who fought a very hard battle for their independence against the most powerful foreign power at the time. Fast forward to the Vietnam War, and here they are trying to fight a war for independence against the most powerful foreign nation. Different in details, but the same in broader terms. Sadly, it was a tragic loss of life on both sides, and while you always want to pick out the hero in every story, in war, it's not exactly black and white. More of a gray area. Number 9. No more heroes. Looking at photos of soldiers coming home from war, you'll see people hugging, cheering, laughing, kissing, and raising a glass to toast the return of their sons and daughters. There's a famous picture from VJ Day that you've probably seen, as a sailor kissing in the streets. However, sadly for Vietnam vets, the return home was not with welcome arms, cheering crowds, or celebrating of any kind, really. The veterans were met with pretty much the opposite. Vietnam was the first war to ever really get the media coverage that it did. For the first time, Americans at home got to see what was going on. And it wasn't pretty. Over time, disapproval for the war grew to the point where it was protested, and soldiers did not receive the care that they needed. As much as we'd like to meme nowadays with Vietnam flashbacks, these soldiers' mental health was not dealt with. PTSD, depression, and a country that didn't want them were very real for shell-shocked men returning home.
Number 8. Bounty jumpers. Fewer than 150 Union soldiers were killed for desertion, and Lincoln was actually constantly writing letters and endorsements reducing soldiers' sentences from death to labor during the war. That's how bad it got. Deserters were a big problem for both the Confederate and Union armies, so it was punishable by death. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Union had 100 deserters roughly a day. That's a lot, every single day. The Union actually used peer pressure at one point just to keep soldiers from leaving. In 1863, the Union offered regiment perks if a certain percentage of original men were on for a following tour of duty. So soldiers inside were making others stay on board. How they did that, what they said, we don't know. Bounty jumpers were men who were paid to fill in the spot of newly drafted soldiers. So these guys would join for a few days and then desert them all over again and join a new post as the new substitute and get paid. And of course, some deserters were branded to avoid this problem. Number 7. Daily diet. These soldiers were all around 25 years old. The minimum age to join, of course, was 18, but a lot of these guys who were that young would often lie about their age anyways on paper. So on paper, the average was 25 years. But these guys were kids, basically. They ate mostly crackers, and when I say crackers, I don't mean the salty work snacks that you have today. These were made of like flour and water and just salt called hardtack. They would eat berries, nuts, and fruits, anything they could find is all they had. Most of these soldiers were close to starving to death. Number 6. Soldiers protest. 1/3 of the Union soldiers were immigrants, 1 in 10 were African American, and those soldiers actually refused their salaries for 18 months to protest being paid lower wages than white soldiers. When black soldiers were signing up in the Union Army in 1863, they were only getting $10 a month, while white soldiers were getting around $13 a month. Officers were getting $700 a month too. It was just insane. To make things even worse, black soldiers were then hit with a $3 monthly cleaning fee, bringing that down to $7 a month now. So a protest was in order and it was held for 18 months, and then come September 1864, black soldiers received equal pay that was retroactive to their enlistment date, so they finally were able to send money back to their families after that long. Number 5. Passing time. You would assume the Civil War and being part of it and everything I've talked about would give you enough anxiety, but gambling was also a common pastime in between battles. And when I say gambling, I don't mean, okay, it's nighttime, let's throw a few bucks down and play dominoes. No, they would gamble on everything. Horse races, chess, euchre, poker, checkers, cards were popular until the end of the Civil War, when of course they were harder to come by, being so flimsy and all. And when dominoes and cards were out of the picture, soldiers would really go old school and play leapfrog. Yeah, games like that were literally all they had. They would wrestle each other for fun, they would have foot races and bet on them. Bowling would be played using cannonballs to knock down wooden pins, and baseball was also played, but it was a little different back then to how we remember it now. The ball was a lot softer, and there was sometimes only 2 bases. The only way you were out also was if you were hit by the ball, hence the softness that I mentioned. Number 4. Coldest winters. With the winter winds rolling in occasionally, soldiers could no longer play baseball outside and peg each other with baseballs, but what you could do was hit each other with snowballs. A little fun, also a little scary. They called it a snow battle. Yeah, a snow battle too. Battle, way more intense. Soldiers would leave with bruises, black eyes, and sometimes even broken bones. Yeah, these guys were blowing off lots of steam, and they would plan attacks and take it obviously seriously, as they did with their daily civil duties. Even officers got in on this action. When pieces of ice were no longer available to large units to throw at one's head, other winter games would include skating and sledding. Number 3. Food March. In April 1863, a group of mostly women led a march to get the governor's attention. The governor at the time, John Letcher, was joined by President Jefferson Davis. It did not end well. The food situation in the South was not great because food prices changed depending on the status of the war. Outcomes of the battle directly affected prices because they were linked to the CSA's currency. That plus the fact that invading troops from the north would often burn crops when they came through, it was getting worse over time. Come April 1863, this march of women broke windows. They flipped carts until eventually they drew out Governor John Letcher and President Jefferson Davis. John Letcher literally started to throw cash at the protesters. Now, they still didn't stop, obviously, that didn't solve problems. It was so bad that the militia almost had to open fire. Number 2. The alligator. I mentioned soldiers and hot air balloons, so I must mention the United States Navy's first submarine. How fun. This 47-foot long submarine that was paddle powered, yep, you heard me, paddle powered, so you'd be inside and you would do this. We can't call it the USS Alligator because it technically didn't see any active days of combat. In fact, the Alligator, that's what I'll call it, had to be cut loose on its first mission. It was being towed behind the USS Sumter on April 2nd, 1863, right off North Carolina when bad weather hit. The Alligator went down and we haven't found it since. It's still out there. The alligator is still lurking out there. Only a few months after this new weapon went down, the Confederate States of America launched their own sub, the H.L. Huntley, and it sank the USS Housatonic near the coast of Charleston, officially marking the first time a submarine sank an enemy ship. It also immediately sank afterwards, taking the lives of 8 crewmen, so even in victory, you're not safe. They made history but only enjoyed it for minutes. This is all tragic. Number 1. the wage gap. Hundreds of women joined the Civil War, and they did so by looking like men. Yeah, they would pull a she's the man and get to work. But the thing is, like I mentioned before, with the CSA's currency being affected by the status of the war, soldiers were getting $13 a month roughly. That's double what a woman could make anywhere on the planet, so they really had no choice but to join. This was long before women's suffrage, so if they thought you were a man, you could use that $13 how you wanted. So it comes to no surprise that women would keep this disguise even after the war ended. In 1909, the US Army officially denied that any woman was ever enlisted in the military service of the United States as a member of any organization of the regular or volunteer army at any time during the period of the Civil War. During the Civil War, though, that was the first time in American history when women all came together in a war effort. Thousands of women from the North and South volunteered as nurses.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have the Tichborne case. This was quite a bizarre legal case that captivated Victorian England in the 1860s and 1870s. It involved a claimant named Arthur Orton who alleged that he was the long-lost heir to the Tichborne baronetcy. Despite numerous inconsistencies in his story, Arthur managed to convince some members of the Tichborne family and a significant portion of the public that he was who he claimed to be. The case went to trial in 1873 and it became a media sensation, with thousands of people lining up outside the courthouse to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. This was basically like the Victorian era's OJ trial, or the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial, you know? The people wanted to know. Despite Arthur's conviction for perjury, the case continued to fascinate the public for years to come, and it became a symbol of the era's fascination with sensationalism and fraud. The Tichborne case remains one of the most infamous legal cases in British history, and is a cautionary tale about the dangers of believing in something without sufficient evidence. In our number 9 spot today we have the London beer flood. This sounds like it would be quite a fun time, but it was anything but that, and instead was a tragic event that occurred on October 17th, 1814 in the St. Giles district of London. At the Mew and Company Brewery, a massive vat containing over 135,000 gallons of beer suddenly ruptured, causing a wave of beer to flood the surrounding streets. The torrent of beer destroyed several nearby houses, killing 8 people and injuring many others. The flood was so powerful that it even knocked down the wall of a nearby pub, trapping and killing some of the patrons inside. The London beer flood was caused by a combination of factors, including poor construction of the vat and overfilling it with beer. The brewery had a history of safety concerns, and many of the workers were aware of the dangers associated with working there. Despite this, the brewery continued to operate, and tragedy struck. The incident became the subject of much media attention at the time, and it continues to be remembered today as a tragic and bizarre event in London's history. The victims of the flood were commemorated with a plaque on the site of the former brewery, and the incident has been the subject of numerous articles, books, and even a stage play. Not sure the logistics of that one though.
Number 8 in our countdown is my favorite pun yet. I put that shit on everything. Except quite literally. Egyptian doctors used human and animal excrement as a cure-all remedy for diseases and injuries. According to Eber's papyrus recording in 1500 BC, animal feces such as donkey, dog, gazelle, and fly were all celebrated for their healing properties and considered to ward off bad spirits. While we know that Egyptian medicine was incredibly advanced, even having doctors who were specialists, you can't help but question this logic. However, like with most things the Egyptians did, technically they weren't wrong. Research shows that microflora found in some types of animal dung contain antibiotic substances. So sure, you risk some tetanus, but you could also be cured. Lizard blood, dead mice, mud, moldy bread were also all used as topical ointments and dressings, and women were also sometimes dosed with horse saliva as a cure for low libido. And speaking of a woman's libido, man, did the Egyptians have some crazy women's healthcare going on. Number 7, we'll call the fertility games. I have a newfound appreciation for modern medicine after learning a way our ancient Egyptian friends tested fertility was by placing a garlic or onion clove inside of a woman's. This is because ancient Egyptians believed that all orifices of a woman were connected, kinda like subway tunnels. Anyways, if the doctor could smell garlic on your breath the next morning, then the tubes were clear and the woman was fertile. But if the doctor couldn't smell garlic, then the tubes were blocked and it was assumed that the woman couldn't give birth. Once you are pregnant though, you can find out the sex of your baby in another bizarre tradition, popping a squat over some barley. Why? Because if it barely grew, then the baby was a boy. If the barley grew like crazy, then the baby was a girl. This test was believed to be highly accurate, and they weren't wrong in that. Turns out the test was actually accurate in 70% of all cases. And in 1963 lab testing, the urine of a pregnant woman did cause the seeds to sprout. Since she was in fact pregnant with a girl, it's likely the seeds start to grow faster due to elevated levels of estrogen, which stimulates growth. I can think of some truly hilarious ways to integrate this into a gender reveal party. But kids aren't for everyone, and that's okay. Ancient Egyptians were notoriously not fans of them, so let's talk number 6, safe sex. There are actually lots of stories of Egyptian contraceptive methods, but don't get too fascinated because these aren't anything you want to try and recreate. Egyptian women would collect the dung of crocodiles or elephants to mix with sacred herbs and honey. They would then apply this paste mixture to their vulva and up inside the vagina as a protective seal on their genitals. Okay, men, don't think you're getting much better though, as your contraceptive was to rub onion juice all over your junk. If neither of these worked, which shocker if they didn't, the Egyptians had an herb called silphium, which was used to help devoid a woman of an unwanted pregnancy. They even knew what has been confirmed today, that achia gum from an achia tree worked as a spermicide and would reduce the likelihood of pregnancy after the fact. While it's impressive they figured out what they did, this whole section just has yeast infection written all over it, so let's just keep going for everybody's sake. Number 5, let's reuse, reduce, and recycle our rotten food. More questionable cure-alls. As I mentioned in point number 8, moldy bread was used by doctors for medical reasons such as medicine or gauzing techniques. This is because Egyptians, from what we can gather, seem to have figured out the antibiotic properties and believed the exposure of mold to a wound would better aid in the immune system for next time, if not at least help quicker healing process this time. But Egyptians also reused other rotten foods. For example, sour milk was also used medicinally. Believed bathing in it would help with skin disease or dryness. I mean, all that sand is bound to have a little bit of a chafy effect. Honey, which also happens to be a natural bacteria killer, may not have been rotten, but it was put on open wounds similar to how we use polysporin today. And while rotten donkey liver may not have been medicine, the Egyptians were quick to slather it on their head and get a nice even dye job. Number 4 in our countdown is a different kind of rotten, the casual neck. The Egyptians were known for their fascination with life, death, and sex. In their beliefs, the god Ra actually created the universe and the first 2 gods through masturbation. Osiris, another god who eventually came along, became father to Horus posthumously after Isis had sex with his dead body. Ra also had sex with Osiris posthumously, but it seems his use of onion juice worked pretty well and he didn't father any children with the dead body. Now, just because it's in their godly pantheon doesn't mean just anyone was necrophilic in ancient Egypt, but those who were may have had that lust arguably feeling a little more justified in their pursuit of rotten ladies. So, there was an issue with necrophilia towards the deceased bodies of Egyptian women, to the extent that their loved ones began a habit of letting their corpses sit out for 2-3 days before passing them to the embalmers, so as to dissuade sex. The logic was that the embalmers wouldn't want to have sex with a body that was already beginning to rot. I mean, they shouldn't want to have sex with the body in the first place, but I guess beggars can't be choosers. Regardless, embalmers were apparently common enough for the Grecian writer Herodotus, who famously documented a lot of culture practices, to make special note of. Let's take a break from the funky stuff to talk about a different kind of pussy. Number 3, the obsession with cats. Guys, I am super biased to this one. Don't know if you can notice the fine sheen of cat hair I rep, but I'm with the ancient Egyptians on the cat praise. Ancient Egyptians were obsessed with cats and even worshipped them. Believed to be gatekeepers of the underworld, these little beasts were spiritual and metaphorical symbols for Egyptians, and they were even believed to be gods themselves. The act of harming, eating, or killing a cat warranted a death penalty as a result. And while adoring your family pet isn't bizarre, the effects of worshipping something are. When the family cat died, every member in the household would shave off their eyebrows to mourn its death. And if a building was burning, people would save the cats before they even put out the fire. Being the first society to domesticate cats, Egyptians used cats for extermination aside from the companionship, which worked so well that their agricultural society dominated that of the Mediterranean for hundreds of years. Of course, there were cons to this obsession. For example, when the Persian invaders showed up using cats as shields, the Egyptian army retreated in fear of killing a cat, allowing the invaders to their soldiers and the pharaoh and take over rule of Egypt. Oops. Unlike other animals, cats were often mummified and buried in tombs dedicated to the goddess Bastet. Recovered cat figurines made of wood, stone, and bronze can be found in museums and collections all across the world. Number 2 is a modern day medical emergency, but to ancient Egyptians, it was just his time of the month. While it's astounding that medical accomplishments that Egyptians had made, specialized doctors, antibiotics, even surgery, you can see from their contraceptives in point 6, Egyptians didn't always nail it. In fact, the disease schistomatsasia, we'll just call it by its second name, bilharzia, was so common that they didn't even realize it was a disease, and it infected nearly everyone. How did it slip under the radar though? The side effects of the disease make people feel sick, and it caused blood in their urine and fecal matter. Seeing as menstruation also came with bloody urine and feeling sick, Egyptians simply thought they were menstruating and came to accept that men had to do the same as women. Blood and urine became a normal part of growing up for boys, and Egyptian society was already very big on gender nonconformity, even having records of sex changes, so this really wasn't outlandish thinking to them. In reality, bilharzia was actually parasitic worms having a field day in their junk. Irregardless, a man peeing blood was even treated as a sign of his fertility. No better sign a man was ready to father a family than being infected with parasites. Man, what a trip this countdown has been. You may be wondering what can take the cake. It's the ceremonial circle in at number 1. So as prior mentioned, ancient Egyptians believed Ra to have created much of life and existence through, well, his masturbatory sessions. This was also believed about the Nile River, Egypt's famous river that flows 6,600 kilometers before it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. These ancient Egyptians believed that the flow of the river represented the frequency of Ra's ejaculations. Seeing as the Nile was the source of Egyptian agriculture, it was incredibly important that that flow remained. Well, it's 4000 BC, and everyday people don't exactly see their gods wandering around. So, with their pharaoh being the personification of God, the duty fell onto him. So, once a year, in the last month of summer, during the festival Min that celebrated the pharaoh's rule, the pharaoh would approach the Nile, remove his robe, and masturbate over the Nile River in a sacred public ceremony. He had a large retinue of men that would also into the river at the same time as him. Once the pharaoh and his men had, well, finished, any man was welcome to unload in the river too. It was believed that these cultural and religious practices would ensure that the Nile would continue to flow for the next year to come, pun intended.